Apologies have been received from Senator Jennifer Brennan O'Connor, and Senator Grace O'Sullivan has had to leave because she has another meeting but may make it back. So members, were in public session, so at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are switched off to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 5 on the agenda is an update on Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan for Housing. I would like to welcome to today's meeting Minister Murphy and the officials from the Department of Housing and Planning and Local Government, and welcome you here again this morning. Before we begin, just a note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Minister Murphy to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, members of the committee, for affording me the opportunity to come and update you on progress made under the implementation of Rebuilding Ireland. And I'm joined today by John McCarthy, Secretary-General, and Assistant Secretaries Maria Graham, Mary Hurley and Paula Mass. Supporting families, individuals and citizens up and down this country who are experiencing homelessness and whose lives are being affected by the housing challenges that Ireland currently faces remains the key priority for this government and for myself as Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government. It's vital that we continue to address and drive the supply of housing, and Rebuilding Ireland provides the framework for this. We continue to face a serious challenge to resolve the crisis of homelessness. The numbers remain far too high, and while there are some positive signs, tackling this issue will continue to be my main focus in 2019. Presentations of families to homeless services in Dublin have fallen for 3 consecutive months now, and of those presenting, greater numbers are being prevented from ever having to enter emergency accommodation. The Dublin Regional Homeless Executive is allocating increased resources to outreach and prevention, and will be working closely together to accelerate this decrease. Our delivery programme for social housing is obviously of critical importance, but in parallel, we are working to deliver a range of initiatives to support those individuals and families that are experiencing homelessness. As we work to deliver the solutions to provide homes for all of the households experiencing homelessness, my department is working closely to deliver a range of emergency accommodation facilities to ensure that we have accommodation available for all. This includes the development of a range of family hub facilities, primarily in Dublin, but also in a number of other areas outside of the capital. In September of this year, I instructed the Dublin Local Authority to deliver 180 emergency beds to ensure that we have sufficient beds to avoid anyone having to sleep on the streets. We will now see the delivery of 203 permanent beds before Christmas, in addition to 130 contingency beds for the cold weather period. We know that individuals engaged in rough sleeping frequently require other supports to help them move from homelessness to an independent tenancy. So, while the short-term imperative may be to provide emergency beds, we are also committed to delivering long-term solutions. The delivery of the National Implementation Plan for Housing First, which I launched with Minister Harris in September, is well underway, and tender competitions have been undertaken in Cork, Galway and Limerick in recent weeks for the delivery of the service in those areas. In Dublin, where rough sleeping is most acute, the recently issued tender for Housing First includes a target to deliver 125 new tenancies in 2029 and a total of 405 new tenancies in the period 2019 to 2021. Housing First will deliver long-term sustainable health and housing solutions for some of our most vulnerable citizens. For families experiencing homelessness, we want to ensure that each and every family is provided with safe and comfortable accommodation, and that they are supported to identify and secure an independent tenancy, whether it be in a local authority allocated dwelling or a HAP-supported tenancy in the private rented sector. Following on from the 3 summits held with local authority chief executives and the first Housing Body Summit, all our efforts are clearly focused on driving delivery forward in a meaningful way. Working collaboratively is showing results. To the end of Q3 of 2018, Rebuilding Ireland has delivered over 63,500 housing solutions across all of our delivery streams. By the end of this year, I expect that number to have grown to approximately 70,000, and we are on course to achieve that. We committed to supporting 137,000 households into appropriate accommodation under build, acquisition, leasing, HAP and RAS programmes over the 6-year period. And by the end of this year, we will have achieved more than 50% of our target. The Government are on track to deliver on the Rebuilding Ireland targets, and funding is in place to secure this delivery. To date, some 17,315 homes have been delivered under build, acquisition and leasing schemes. The new build pipeline now in place is growing, as evidenced in the Q3 Construction Status Report, which has just been published. The report focuses on local authority and housing body new build projects across various programmes and demonstrates that the number of schemes and homes in the new build pipeline has more than doubled since the end of 2016, with 17,676 homes now built or progressing through the various stages of construction or the approval process. I am committed, as Minister, to increase build activity at a faster pace, and with the latest construction status report showing nearly 5,000 homes on site and under construction, and a further 2,652 homes at the final pre-construction stage, the delivery of our build target is on track. As we know, build delivery tends to be end-year focused. Unlike last year, we will see over 50% of our build delivery come through by the end of the year. As Minister, I've also been clear that we need to address issues of housing affordability, recognising the pressure that exists for low to middle income households, particularly in Dublin. However, all local authorities are carrying out economic assessment of the requirement for affordable housing in their areas and the viability to deliver such affordable housing from their sites. In terms of affordable purchase, I've now commenced the relevant provisions of the Housing Act of 2009, the effect of which is to place the new scheme for affordable purchase on a statutory footing. I expect the associated regulations and guidance to issue to local authorities shortly. This is not delaying the necessary assessment or the development of proposals around land for the development of affordable housing. Acknowledging that renters in Dublin and other urban centres are currently facing significant affordability challenges, I am committed to the introduction of a not-for-profit cost rental sector in Ireland. Together with delivering more predictable rents, cost rental will make a sustainable impact on housing affordability. The Housing Agency, Dún Laoghaire County Council and a number of housing bodies are currently assessing the tenders for our first cost rental pilot at Enniskerry Road. I expect that project to be on site in the first quarter of 2019. In parallel, Dublin City Council, my department and the National Development Finance Agency undertook more detailed modelling and financial appraisal on a major site at St Michael's Estate in Inchicore, which Dublin City Council will now develop as a major cost rental project. In order to support the affordable housing programmes of local authorities, the Government has committed €310 million over the 3 years 2019 to 2021 under the Service Sites Fund, announced as part of Budget 2019. The funding is available for key facilitating infrastructure on public lands to support the provision of affordable homes to purchase or to rent. I envisage a maximum amount of service site funding of €50,000 per affordable home, and on this basis at least 6,200 affordable homes could be facilitated. I've now awarded funding of €43 million under the first call for proposals. The projects selected in this first call are in Dublin and in Cork and will enable the delivery of 1,400 affordable homes on local authority lands, as well as over 700 social housing homes, where local authorities are bringing forward these sites as part of mixed tenure developments. There are also 5 projects that are still under active consideration, the total funding for which is €8 million, and which have the potential to deliver some 230 affordable homes. These projects are in Fingal, Galway City, Kildare, Meath and Wicklow, and my department is working with those local authorities to make these proposals happen. I expect the infrastructure works on the approved projects to begin as soon as possible, and a second call for proposals under the fund will be made very shortly. The scope of that call will be influenced by the information received from local authorities as part of the aforementioned economic assessments. In terms of furthering our ambition to maximise the utilisation of vacant housing stock, my department published the National Vacant Housing Reuse Strategy 2018 to 2021 in Q3. My department are continuing to work with local authorities in relation to their vacant home action plans. The work is supported by the Vacant Homes Officers, funded by my department, to coordinate local actions addressing vacancy and to provide a clear, signposted source of information for owners of vacant homes, including the funding options that are available to assist in bringing vacant homes back into productive use. In relation to the rental sector, the Government has now given its approval to the publication of the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill of 2018. The bill provides a number of key measures and reforms designed to enhance enforcement powers for the RTB, provide greater security of tenure for tenants, and further underpin the operation of rent pressure zone arrangements, along with some further targeted priority measures. My department is working closely with the RTB to ensure that adequate resources are provided to tackle any capacity constraints. The proposed new powers for the RTB are a crucial first step in expanding its overall role and function as part of a multi-annual change management programme to proactively enforce tenancy law within the rental sector. The committee is aware of the proposals I recently announced to address the short-term tourism-related letting of properties through amendments to planning legislation. I propose to regulate short-term letting through the existing exempted development regime by facilitating unlimited home sharing and the letting of a person's entire home for a maximum period of 90 days per year without the need for planning permission. In addition, if a person wishes to let a second property that isn't their principal private residence, they may only do so if they obtain planning permission, and this approach will be underpinned by amendments to planning regulations and complementary amendments to primary planning legislation. Last week, I also published the Urban Development and Building Heights Guidelines for Planning Authorities under Section 28 of the Planning and Development Act of 2000, as amended. These guidelines set out a new and updated national planning policy on building heights in relation to urban areas, elaborating on the strategic policy framework set out in Project Ireland 2040 and the National Planning Framework. And these are a part of a suite of integrated measures and policy shifts to break the current patterns and development trends for our cities and towns and create more compact and integrated communities. I have said previously that we need to shift away from business as usual development patterns and create a more adaptive and forward-looking vision. Our cities and our towns must grow upwards, not just outwards, if we're to meet the many challenges ahead. Along with the apartment guidelines published earlier this year, these height guidelines represent the final reforms to our planning guidelines for apartment development, which continue to increase at pace. Finally, I want to thank the committee for its engagement with myself and my department to date, and I look forward to continuing our very important work in 2019. You can be assured that we at the department are all committed to addressing homelessness, accelerating housing delivery, tackling vacancy, as well as ensuring the reform of the rental sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, just in private session we agreed that we would do 10-minute sessions, so 10 minutes to question you, and it's up to members how they use that. If they use the full 10 minutes without going to you, but then you don't have the opportunity to come back. But I'll indicate at 5 minutes when 5 minutes have been used. So we hopefully get a couple of sessions, and that members will indicate which pillar they're asking the question on. So if they could reference that as well. So our first member is Senator Boyle.
Well, firstly, I want to thank the Minister for coming in here, and to John McCarthy, Secretary-General, and your senior staff, because I think it's an important engagement. And I suppose I want to stay focused here, because what are we here today to do? The purpose for us here today as a joint committee is to discuss and examine the progress in relation to this document, Rebuilding Ireland. It's not aspirations, it's not things that stray off here, and I'm going to keep my attention focused on this document. And I said at the very outset when Simon Coveney came in, I said it was a brave politician that sets out targets long before let's face it, 2.5 years ago it happened, and that they could be there, they were trackable, they were traceable, and we could hold the Minister to account. You're his successor, and I know you're happy to be held to account, and you acknowledge the importance and the role of this committee as a statutory Oireachtas committee dealing and shadowing effectively your department. So I want to again thank you and the senior management team and the Secretary-General down in the department, who I've always found to be very professional and very helpful, and I suppose to say conscious that they too need support, because, Minister, I want to start by saying I came in here initially thinking councillors need support, your department needs support, your staff need more support. That's my experience to do the task and the job. And sometimes when you're at the very centre of power and decision making, particularly at the level that you are in the department, you might not be conscious of the needs within your own department. And it's not to say that you're ignoring them, but you're not conscious of them. You're a busy politician like most. I just want to put that down as a marker. I think you need to look at that again, and you need additional resources there to meet the challenges and to support the local authorities. So, just to get a few things off the way, and I'm not really expecting you to come back with a very detailed answer of everything now, but maybe you might give a commitment that you would follow up on these questions through a sort of written response or an email to the committee, if you can't deal with them all now. And I suppose I'm going to kick off by saying Shangana site. And I am sick to the teeth hearing about Shangana Castle and site and who's going to own it and who's to blame. And I'm hearing stories from the local people out in Dunleary that it's a matter for the department. There's total frustration with the process. I'm hearing another story from the elected members, which is another angle on it. I'm hearing from the people who live out in Shankill, another problem. So, Minister, what I'm going to suggest is that, and you did agree in fairness to Deputy Boyd Barrett, who's here, and I welcome him, many months ago, that you would have a roundtable meeting with the stakeholders. And because there's so much misinformation out there, I think it's about time that the Oireachtas members for that constituency, the county council for that constituency, your senior management team and the chief executive of Dunleary should come together and sit down at one table and hear what is actually the story, because there's too many different stories and they're not joining up, and there's a general frustration that we have the potential for 500 houses. I mean, that place is in state ownership. I was talking to Michael McDougall, who was then Minister for Justice, who sanctioned the whole sale of the whole thing. So I just want to flag that as an issue. Secondly, I'd like to, you talked about Enniskerry Road, I'd like an update, because again I'm saying, people have told me, if that had been left to the local authority years ago, they would have built the houses by now. There's not a house on the Enniskerry Road, so I want to look at that. Thirdly, I'd like you to look again at the whole issue of the local development agency, the land development agency. We still are not aware of the underlying legislation. When that's the time frame for all that, you might just cover that off. Fourthly, Bord Pleanála, the online issues of Bord Pleanála. We've been talking about, in Rebuilding Ireland, about how people could engage. We talked about fast-tracking on Bord Pleanála. Now there's new management structures in there, but we need on Board Pleanála to come up and sharpen up and be faster. And I know I'm conscious that you have to keep a certain distance from on Board Pleanála, but in the document Rebuilding Ireland, there's talk about online engagement in the planning process. It's not happening. People are frustrated by the process. There's to be reform, needs to be major reform. And then I just want to go to some key messages, and they are key questions really, back to the document. Just two general comments as well. What process and checks does the Department use to display and update their data in relation to the Rebuilding Ireland, specifically in terms of publication and the internal purposes for that? And then two, is there a table that updates continuously, on a continuous basis, such as weekly or monthly, or is there just this sense of gathering? And I get this sense sometimes, a gathering of information because you're in the Dáil, so it's PQs, or you're coming in here, so you gather another load of information. And I appreciate that you're a busy person, so I'm not here to an attack. I'm just saying, where is this ongoing, continuously monitoring of this document, which is called Rebuilding Ireland? And then I'm just going to be specific now about some questions. In Pillar 1, which is addressing homeless, why has Action 1.30 switched from progress to ongoing? How much progress has been made under the Rapid Delivery Framework? And then the second one there, Action 1.34, 1.35 and 1.36 continue to remain categorised as ongoing. What level of progress, if any, has been made in regard to these proposals? And I'll just go on here then quickly, Pillar 2. Okay, and Pillar 2, Action 2.15 relates to the establishment of a regulator for the AHB sector. This was overdue. Can you report on progress in relation to this matter? What's your intention? And then in relation to 220 relates to supports for people leaving the HSE accommodation and for those leaving mental health services. This project was to be rolled out between 2018 and 2020. Could you provide an update on how many tenancies have been created to date for those transitioning from mental health facilities to community-based living as of today? I'll come back later, Minister, if I have time. Thanks.
Thanks, Victor. Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator, for your questions. I mean, just in your opening comments, you talked about the importance of having targets, and absolutely, because they bring transparency, they provide for accountability, they'll help us drive delivery, although we won't always reach those targets, but they'll also show us what is working and what isn't. So it's important that we have those and we work to them. And in relation to the support of my own department, I'm well aware of the needs of my own department. Some reconfiguration has happened recently in terms of bringing in additional staff at an Assistant Secretary level to help reorganise some functions to help us drive additional aspects of Rebuilding Ireland more quickly. But there are many stakeholders in this, and it's not just the Department of Housing, it's obviously the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, the Department of Finance, a number of agencies that are involved, Housing Agency, Housing Finance Agency, the NDFA, which is actually very important in terms of some of the issues that I'll get to around Shanganagh. But work is, I mean, around Shanganagh, work has been continuing. It's not as if nothing has been happening. What we've been trying to do between the NDFA and the County Council is to get the financial model right so that when we do this, it works. Because the worst thing to do would be to have gotten the numbers wrong. And it's complex enough financial modelling when you're talking about trying to drive a site like this. But a delivery board is in place now. And I think that, you know, I'd have absolutely no problem if we were to meet with the delivery board to hear about what they want to see and how quickly they want to see it happen. We have staff out there today meeting with relevant officials around that project because we continue to work on this project. And last week I had a meeting with the Vice President of the European Investment Bank to talk about wider ambition here across the scheme of affordability delivery that we want to drive. In relation to Enniskerry Road, I understand that in January or February of next year we're going to go to tender. That process is nearing to completion, so we can actually award a tender. Award the tender in January or February of next year. The Land Development Agency, I have the heads of the bill, which I want to bring to Cabinet. We have one more Cabinet before the end of the calendar year. It's my intention to bring the bill to that Cabinet if I can finalise the heads. I'm also going to announce the interim board at that point in time, if I can do that as well. Obviously, that depends on being able to get that item onto the Cabinet agenda. It's a busy time of year in terms of things coming onto the Cabinet agenda, but we continue to work full steam ahead with the LDA. They are up and running already as a body, just not under statutory legislation. We have money that we can now appropriate to them this year, thanks to the supplementary estimate that we took last night. They are ready to almost submit planning permission on some of the first sites. So they are working and they're going well for a new agency that was only established a couple of months ago. But the legislation is important, obviously, in terms of it being able to capitalise further projects over the course of next year. In relation to An Bord Pleanála is independent, of course it is. There is a new chairperson recently appointed who's come from the department, so is well aware of, I suppose, what we want to achieve under Rebuilding Ireland and the task at hand. Additional board members above the usual amount have been appointed. New staff have been appointed to that new delivery team. And when it comes to the multi-unit developments, the over 100 homes or the over 200 student spaces, 100% in terms of their delivery record, in terms of meeting the timelines. And thousands of homes have now been approved over the course of the past year under that new fast-track delivery. It is going well. And while I haven't spoken with the new chair in detail about the e-planning programme, I spoke with the outgoing chair about this in terms of progress made and further work that's underway in terms of their ICT systems. So An Bord Pleanála continues to, it has seen its workload increase quite significantly over the past few years. As a result, we have given it additional resources and additional funding, and we continue to do so. In relation to data that's published by the department, it really depends on the data. But we monitor certain things on an ongoing basis, and we produce monthly information, for example, in relation to planning permissions. Other data will come out at other intervals, and then it depends where we're collecting it from. Are we collecting it from local authorities directly? Are we collecting it from regional leads who are collecting it themselves from local authorities? And then there's the statistician in the department, there's a whole section there that do that work, and then it goes up to various levels of management to be checked and verified, and then with most pieces of information that are being published, obviously I as Minister will take a look, and if I have questions then I will query some of the data as to whether I think it makes sense or is something adding up or not. So it goes through a number of checks and balances in that regard, and then obviously then other data is published separate to us, which we will then always look at and see, well, how does this compare to data that's been produced either by us or by one of our agencies, and to see, well, does it confirm a trend or does it question a trend and that type of thing. So a huge amount of work does go into that in terms of data and figures. And then we're constantly trying to improve our data collection methods. We are currently undergoing ways of how we can include our data collection when it comes to those in emergency accommodation. And we are also, since we engaged with the CSO and I asked them to take on board responsibility for counting the number of completions, we now have that new information, which is much better information than relying solely on extrapolations from ESB connection data. So I understand the need to constantly be improving our data and making sure that the data that we're publishing is informative and helping inform the public debate on what needs to be done. In relation, you asked some specific questions under the different pillars as per the table that was updated. I know on AHB regulation, because I'm very close to it, we do have the voluntary basis, which has been led by the housing agency in terms of getting housing bodies onto that voluntary level of regulation. We are moving to statutory regulation. We do have a bill to be progressed. It is a priority. It's not going to make it this year, so it's going to be coming in early next year. But we continue to work with housing bodies to help those smaller ones in particular. And the difficulty here is with the Tier 1 housing bodies, the smaller housing bodies, because they are smaller organisations, they're volunteers, getting them in line with the voluntary regulation before we move to full statutory regulation. And of course we have the issue around classification, which is being led out of the Department of Finance, because we're treating that as an accountancy issue that won't impact on our delivery with housing bodies. You also asked under, I think, the first pillar in relation to the rapid delivery. In terms of 130, Dublin City Council put a framework in place for volumetric build apartments. I think that's been in the papers. They're hoping to get that out and published, I think, before the end of the year. I know they've been working to do that. And once we have that framework, then we can run mini competitions from that in each local authority to start building rapid upwards. And then in relation to the, that's for 1,000 projects, you asked us about, and another action under that is modular clusters. We're progressing well with that in terms of three sites that have been identified for modular clusters. That framework will be in place by the end of the year. Galway and Louth are already advancing on those sites. And I'll have to come back to you with information in relation to people transitioning from mental health accommodation, because I don't have it to hand.
We're gone well over
Thanks, well done.
You're okay, Victor, because we've gone well over. Great, thanks. Owen?
Thanks very much, and Minister, thanks for your opening statement. And just before I ask the questions, I just want to acknowledge the very significant amount of work that the staff do in terms of the preparation of the reports for today's meeting, particularly the pipeline report and the progress report. They're very, very detailed pieces of work, and I just want to acknowledge the effort that goes into them. Just a series of questions, Minister, on each of the pillars. I'll just go through them one by one. We're almost halfway through the lifespan of Rebuilding Ireland, so we're almost kind of 2.5 years into what's essentially a 5-year plan. And if you look at the spend on emergency accommodation to date, it's gone from €70 million a year to this year, following last night's supplementary estimate, €176 million a year. That's a 193% increase. Now, I'm not at all arguing against the provision of emergency accommodation and better quality emergency accommodation, but I suppose I just want to raise a concern that, halfway into this plan, where the government keeps telling us that very significant amounts of money are being spent and progress has been made, one of the key indicators of what I would say is failure, as in the spend on emergency, is increasing dramatically. So I suppose my question is, at what point do you think in the lifespan of Rebuilding Ireland are we going to see the spend on emergency accommodation start to fall? Because clearly that's a very key indicator of things beginning to improve at the rough end. I also have a question around the modular hubs. And again, I'm not against better quality emergency accommodation for families than hotel rooms and B&Bs. But in a couple of parliamentary question responses I've got, I have some very significant concerns about the project, albeit on the limited information that we have. In both those parliamentary question responses, you have said that there could be a dispensation from or a relaxation of building regulations for these modular hubs. Could you tell the committee explicitly where the relaxation or dispensation from the building regulations could be? I wasn't one of those people who attacked the idea of modular housing when it was first being proposed, because I understand fully modular housing can be very good quality housing if it meets all of the building regulations. I am worried, however, with these modular hubs that we are looking at something much closer to what the public perception of modular is, which is more like prefabs or MOSNI type accommodation. So again, if you can give us as much clarity on the quality of those builds, I'd appreciate that. Pillar 2, social housing, can you give us the totals for the Q3 build, acquisition, lease and HAP and RAS? They're not in the report. I appreciate the report was only finalised last night, and I'll come back with a supplementary when you give me those, just in terms of where we're at with the targets. One of the things I'm particularly keen, and we discussed this last night, is clearly there's been a significant fall off on the leasing target, and you're trying to match that overall with increases in acquisitions. But I don't see how the numbers and the funding matches, so if you can maybe give us some reassurance on that. And also a short question, the pipeline report, could from the next quarter traveller-specific accommodation be included? I know you did give me a potentially positive response in a parliamentary question where you said it would be looked at, but I think this committee would really like to see the progress of traveller-specific social housing, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be in this report. There aren't a huge number of projects out there. On the private housing in Pillar 3, I've no in-principle objection to densification, and it's one of the aspects of the National Planning Framework that I'm broadly supportive of. But with respect to the report that you've given us today and the new guidelines, I have two very specific questions. In producing that report and the planning requirements that are now in it, was there an impact assessment on land values in our urban centres as a result of increasing heights? We know, for example, that as you increase the heights, you increase the profitability from inner city sites, and that has an inflationary impact on land values. So specifically, was that looked at? Equally, there are some people who argue that there's a certain tipping point between height and density, so that as you begin to move up in height, you increase density, but then after a certain height, you actually don't have any significant gains in density because you need more space, etc. around. Again, was there any specific study done in the relation of what is the tipping point in terms of height and density, and what height gives you maximum density, particularly in the, I suppose, areas like inside of the canals here in Dublin that the plan wants to densify? Also, I note there's been no housing commencement data published since August, either by the Department or by the CSO. Can you explain the reason for that? Is it just that the data hasn't been uploaded yet, and when will we get the commencement data for new builds for public and private sector housing? On the rental sector, and Minister, you know, certainly my party, I'm almost done with the questions, has been broadly supportive of your intention to bring new powers for the Residential Tenancies Board, and we were discussing in private session earlier on today, we want to progress that bill quickly in the new year. I am, however, very, very concerned at what seems to be the preference for criminal sanctions rather than civil sanctions, simply because it would mean the RTB will have to take cases to court, which will be expensive and time-consuming. Can you just clarify whether it is the intention to make those criminal rather than civil, and if so, to explain why? And then the last question, I suppose, is just on the right to housing, because it's been a matter of public debate between the President's speech this week and the Simon Committee's launch yesterday. 2014 Constitutional Convention, 84% in favour of constitutional right to housing. Programme for Government had a commitment for it to be looked at, although that was taken away from this committee and given to Finance, and they have yet to do so. We had the President's speech this week. Yesterday, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission's research by Amórach, 63% support a constitutional right to housing. Is this something that the government has simply set its face against, or is it something you're willing to consider, and how can we have a discussion about that?
Minister.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. And just to thank you for acknowledging the work of the staff, because they are doing a huge amount of work, and it's always appreciated, I know, when they are acknowledged for the hard work that they do, and I know that they give this committee a lot of time, and they're happy to do so. We're halfway through rebuilding Ireland, roughly. And when you look at the spend on emergency accommodation, it has increased. Now, not all of that goes towards actual provision of emergency accommodation. A lot of that money will go towards prevention as well. So, but I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't an issue, right, in terms of people needing to have supports there coming from government and coming from local authorities. It's not the only measure of success of the plan. And if you look at it in isolation, it will tell you only one thing. But if you look at the amount of money, say, that's increasing in terms of the delivery of new homes, that's another way of measuring, well, look, delivery is clearly happening because of the amount of extra money that we're spending. Or you look at other targets that we have, or other measures that we have around planning permissions, commencement notices, and those types of things. One of the interesting things, I think, is always not about how we spend our money, or not how much we spend, but how we spend it. And when we look at what is programmed into Rebuilding Ireland, we know that as we get to 2020 and 21, we'll be spending more money getting people into stock of social housing than we will be in terms of the provision of HAP. HAP will always be there. HAP will always have a need. There'll always be people who will want to avail of HAP. But we'll be spending our money in a better and more efficient way when we're spending it on increasing the stock, rather than spending as much as we are spending now on HAP. So that will happen over the course of the plan in terms of a reprogramming of money, if you like, and that's built into the plan. In relation to modular hubs, I mean, I think the important thing to do here is that as long as we can give people, quality accommodation, which is temporary, and for emergency accommodation, we're building amazing homes. If you've been to any new housing scheme that's been opened recently, the quality is fantastic, and that's as it should be. Emergency accommodation also has to be of as good a standard as we can make it. These modular clusters are different. We don't have them yet in Ireland. They have worked successfully in the UK, and we want to progress them. In relation to standards around that, we get complaints all the time in terms of people saying, oh, there's too much red tape in the department, the standards are too high, or the regulations that are there. What we are looking to do is absolutely in line with the very successful projects that they've had in the UK. I think there's one I know in particular in detail because I looked into it. It's either in Glasgow or Edinburgh, where they had about, I think, 30 to 40 modular homes on a site. But the kind of regulations that you need are different to the regulations that you might have in an apartment building, obviously, because these are multi-unit, or that you might have in stackable rapids in a volumetric scheme. So I do have a more detailed note that I can supply to you in terms of the changes that have been made. But everything is being done in terms of making sure that certain minimum standards are not breached, around things like heating, but also fire regs, the security of the building, the safety of the building in terms of its structural integrity. This is not about half measures at all. It's about making sure that we are not gold plating what needs to be done in terms of what has been successful in other countries. In relation to the social housing targets, I'm trying to, you had asked for a breakdown, sorry. So in terms of the Q3 report that was published, under that the breakdown is new build at 1764, void programme at 605, acquisitions at 605, acquisitions at 1661, leasing at 476, HAP 13741, and RAS 534. And that's the breakdown. 534 for RAS. In relation to our targets, and we talked about leasing yesterday evening, Deputy, in committee. So, leasing and what we wanted to achieve, I suppose, in the first period, the first year or more, was working well. But as we look at now what's been delivered or what might be delivered under enhanced leasing, and we've gone out twice on enhanced leasing in terms of expressions of interest, it isn't delivering what we thought it would be. So we have to look at that now to see what other changes might need to be made to see if we can bring along delivery more quickly. I think I know where a couple of the sticking points are, but these are ones that cannot be resolved on our own in the Department of Housing. And so I've asked Minister English to engage with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to see if further changes can be made to that enhanced leasing programme, to see if we can. I mean, there was considerable interest in these programmes, but some of the interested parties that came forward just didn't have, I think, all of the requirements that we needed. But then there were other concerns that were raised about things on our side. So Minister English is going to examine those with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform as a priority, because we have to deliver a certain amount of homes under leasing. But as a result of leasing not hitting what we wanted it to hit, as we discussed yesterday evening, we've had to do more with acquisitions. We've done more with acquisitions because we could get the money to do it, because it's still value for money in certain local authorities outside of Dublin, and because housing bodies are pursuing acquisitions because they make sense in terms of their own programme, and we know that there's been some bank acquisitions that we've been able to get our hands on, which I think has been a good thing to do. In relation to the pipeline report and including traveller-specific accommodation, yes, we are looking at that. I mean, one of the difficulties that we have, we allocate funding, we have the policies, we have it as a priority. One of the difficulties that we do have is around getting planning and around local objection when it comes to traveller accommodation. And I think this committee needs to have a conversation about the role of elected representatives when it comes to objecting to planning permissions, because it is still happening, even though I know that we have all sought to try and help, take politicians at least. Citizens will always have the right to object, whether they're objecting for spurious grounds or not. But I think sometimes, unfortunately, and we might see more of it now as the local elections come closer, some people who are candidates might seem to be doing what they think is in the interest of the local community, but it isn't, in terms of supporting local residents' objections to new housing, be it social housing, be it traveller-specific accommodation, or be it private housing, because that is happening as well. And again, I mean, it speaks to a bigger problem that we have in terms of people who are able and fortunate to be living in an area and own a home. And we need to provide more homes. We need to increase the densification of our urban centres. That's just a fact. The densities in a lot of parts that are very close to very expensive infrastructure, be it transport infrastructure, be it schools or everything else, just isn't being used efficiently. And that means building up. But to come to that later part of your question, Deputy, heights isn't a way of achieving density necessarily. Anyone who's sat and helped design a city development plan or a county development plan like I have knows that density is achieved in many other ways. And that's why the first thing that we did when it came to looking at apartment guidelines is actually to look around things around density, number of units per core, car parking provision, the aspect ratio, all of these things that would help provide more apartments on a site. Height helps, and we saw it on a previous piece of work that we did. When you get to a point about 6 stories, a shoulder height, which the guidelines now do provide for, and actually they're trying to make it a default position in our urban cores, that there will be a 6-story shoulder height. That absolutely helps in terms of density. As you go beyond that, the height densification question, if you like, becomes one of diminishing returns. But what it does allow you to do is have things like mixed uses, which we need to see. So you can have other uses that aren't just about people living in that building, but people living and people working, or other types of facilities, community facilities, sporting facilities, those types of things. So height allows us to do more in that particular site in terms of livability, not just about densification in terms of providing more apartments.
Over there, so I have to move on to the next person. So
will I get an opportunity to come back?
You will, yeah, no problem. The next is Dara.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister, for your presentation. Excuse me. I just want to return to some of the questions that have been asked, but just specifically to get back to the last point in relation to housing delivery figures for this year. The figures that you've given, when you break them down, you're about 4,506 between new builds, voids, acquisitions and leasing, and then 14,275 through HAP and RAS, obviously to a lesser degree. And that seems to be, you made a comment there that you would see by 2020 that there will be more builds than than short-term housing measures. And that's one thing that I've raised consistently here, is my concern of our over-reliance in the private rental market, and particularly around HAP. Could you give me, when you see that tipping point actually happening, when you see it actually equalising based on your plans in Rebuilding Ireland, like 2/3 of what we're meeting this year, which is deemed that people that deem that their housing need is met, are through housing assistance payment. Many of them are relatively short-term leases, 12 months. So I know you say at committee on a regular basis that it suits a lot of people. That's not the evidence that I have from the people that I meet, that HAP is not a home for many people. It's not a long-term solution. So I continue to be very concerned about the over-reliance on it. Could you give me a projection for the HAP spend in 2019? I know that there was some that we to provide additional funds in this year's budget, but I'm interested to see how you see that actually us catching up on the capital side and more people being housed permanently, and it is a concern I have. You mentioned in the in your statement as well, I want to just return to the service site fund and the €310 million for delivery of affordable homes, which is something that you and I discussed and that we negotiated as part of the budget. You mentioned in one part, though, that you didn't read into the record that you expect the associated regulations and guidance to issue to local authorities shortly. That's in your written statement. I'm just wondering when. When do you actually feel that we would actually have the criteria published for an affordable housing scheme? As you know, this was a major priority for Fianna Fáil in the budget negotiations. I'm pleased to see that I know local authorities, including my own, are engaging with that of delivery of affordable homes for working people on state-owned land, and I wholeheartedly support it, but I just want to get a time frame, and I think it is real delivery, but 6,200 homes that can be delivered under this. I think when we start rolling this out, this can be and should be expanded further, because we have to look at that. So if you could give me a time frame for the publication of regulations, that would be greatly appreciated. The Land Development Agency you've mentioned as well, and you mentioned you're bringing the heads of the bill to Cabinet. When do you actually see the bill coming to the House here to actually debate the workings of the Land Development Agency? And it brings me to two other questions relating to pending legislation. Again, Deputy O'Brien alluded to it, and we have, both myself and Deputy O'Brien have engaged with you extensively on the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, which we're hoping to see strengthening the rights of students and student accommodation, but also the enhanced powers for the Residential Tenancies Board. I suppose the statement that you've given, I mean this respectfully, on page 9 of your statement, is something that you could have delivered to us a couple of months ago. I'm just wondering, when do you intend, or what is the delay with bringing this bill forward? Is there a disagreement in relation to the criminal versus civil potential penalties for landlords? I would be absolutely of a view, and my party would be, is that we should move towards civil penalties. The whole issue with the RTB is the issue of bringing enforcement orders to court. I don't think that's required in many instances. So I would like to get a real update. When do you intend to bring that forward? Both Fianna Fáil, I know Sinn Féin and others actually have legislation that's there. We held back on it. We've published it on the basis that this bill was going to be brought forward, and that you were going to include some of that in the Residential Tenancies Bill. And furthermore than that brings me to, you've mentioned short-term letting. Again, you've mentioned in your statement, we know what you've said so far in relation to dealing with short-term letting and regulations. Again, when? When can we see this actually brought forward, that we can actually get it implemented? The Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, I think, is very important. Could I ask you, your department's doing a review, and I asked this at committee previously, of the Rebuilding Ireland affordable loans, a review on the basis of the standardisation of criteria for, and particularly financial underwriting, because there have been differences between local authorities. Could you tell me where that review is at? Have we standardised the financial underwriting criteria, and indeed what's required for the applications themselves? And could you give me an update in relation to the loan approval rate or percentages? We had a refusal rate of about 2/3, which is reduced to 50%. So 1 in 2 were being refused at the moment. Where is that at now? What's the level of drawdown as well there? Just moving on to the repair and lease scheme, that hasn't been mentioned in your statement. I know you can't mention everything, to be fair, but repair and lease, 5. I'll conclude with 2 very quick ones. We made changes, obviously administrative changes in February of this year to repair and lease. Have those changes made a difference? Have we seen an increase in properties coming out via the repair and lease scheme? Because I think the concept of it is very good. I'm just hoping we're not strangling ourselves with regulation. And my final question, I'll come back with a few more, is in relation to the Eurostat classification for approved housing bodies as being on balance sheet and the future impact of the AHBs to deliver social housing units. Have you an update on that in relation to discussions? You mentioned you had met with the European Investment Bank as well, because the housing delivery through approved housing bodies is a major part of government strategy and will be a part of the solution. But obviously the on-balance sheet issue will become a greater issue in relation to, and may actually stymie further delivery in that sector. And then the very final thing is that the rapid build units, have we given up on them? Basically, I know the targets we were way off kilter last year, and so far this year. Have you shelved the rapid build unit idea, or is that being revised within the department?
Thank you, Darragh. Minister.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Deputy, for the questions. I'll try and get through as much as I can in the time allocated to me. So, in relation to HAP, I mean, the numbers of HAP, and you were provided a report on HAP in terms of how many people are actually successfully in a HAP accommodation. I think we've tenanted at least 40,000, upwards on that, through the HAP programme, and it is working for those people. And we aren't seeing an abnormal number of people exiting HAP as a result of the tenancy breaking down than you would see, in a traditional private rental market. So it isn't having the impacts that people claim it is having. I know that there are individual cases that people will find themselves in difficulty and will have to deal with as local TDs, but that doesn't mean that the programme itself isn't working.
Just to clarify, maybe it's more a conceptual thing, sorry to interrupt, that deeming people that their housing need has been met under HAP is something I would fundamentally disagree
well, we
with.
see that as meaning their need, because they're going to be able to stay in that accommodation, they're going to be able to continue to work or increase their hours of work, and if that accommodation, for whatever reason, the lease no longer continues to be there, they can move on to another accommodation and still have that HAP support that's there. I think we've seen something like 1,500 people exit HAP off the transfer list into the permanent stock of social housing. And I think we've seen as many as, is it 10,000 exit out of HAP? 2,000 exit out of HAP, sorry, because they no longer required HAP, because their own circumstances had changed, which I think is very welcome. But there are upwards of 40,000 HAP tenancies that have been created.
Were housed through the transfer list.
I think it's 1,500, but
okay, that's great.
1,600, sorry, 1,600. We'll spend 422 million next year on HAP, and that will support people who are in current HAP tenancies and the creation of new HAP tenancies. And I think we'll reach a tipping point, and I've talked about this before, through the course of 2020 to 2021. And that obviously is the final year of Rebuilding Ireland. But by that point in time, we will have recovered the building of social housing by local authorities and housing bodies sufficiently that there'll be now, enough of an increase in the stock of social housing year on year that will be the primary method by which we support people. And that continues now into the National Development Plan, because that commitment is there out to 2027 in terms of the amount of money that's been provided. It's another big figure, but it's 110,000 if we look from this year to 27. 110,000 social housing homes have been built in that period of time. The Service Sites Fund, we'll publish the criteria in a week. It's basically almost there, so I hope to do it next week before the dole rises. But we know the basic qualifying criteria. We know it's €75,000 for a couple, we know it's 50,000 for an individual. You have two tables in the documentation that was provided to you. The first table are those funds that have been, those sites that have been agreed in principle, and the second table are those sites that we're now working on to get them to agreed in principle. So we're going to run the Service Sites Fund kind of like we've run the Urban Regeneration Fund. A stream, a B stream and a C stream. A stream, you're ready to go, get going. B stream needs a bit more work, and C stream are those who weren't successful, but we want to get them into the B stream quickly. At the moment, every local authority has been asked to do an economic assessment in its own area as to how it's going to deliver affordable homes on its own public land. And as we get that back, that'll inform our second call, which will go out in the new year. In relation to the Land Development Agency, I want this bill through the House by Easter, because I want to get that extra capital into the LDA as quickly as possible. If I publish the heads of the bill next week, we'll then need pre-legislative scrutiny to happen by the Oireachtas committee. I hope to appoint a board as quickly so that it can start to do certain things. The agency is already working, so it can start to do things that it needs to do in terms of accounts, hire additional staff and everything else. It has an ambition to start lodging its first planning applications next year, and I don't want to do anything that's going to delay that. But it is up and running, but the bill is important. The legislation is important to have there. In relation to the rent bill, I'll just look at the student accommodation first of all. So currently, if it's student accommodation that's let under a tenancy agreement, it's covered, it's there. But what we're trying to do, as you know, and from the conversations that you and Deputy O'Brien and I have had, and had with Minister Mary Mitchell O'Connor, is to make sure that purpose-built student accommodation under a licence, or other accommodation that might be under a licence, student accommodation under a licence by a public body, is also captured. And we are still trying to compile the evidence and the information to make sure that it's robust, so that when it comes forward, because we're bringing it forward as a committee stage. So you'll see what I published yesterday. It's going to come forward as a committee stage amendment, because we still have to do that extra work on the student piece. But we still have time, because it's not going to be retrospective. Obviously, it's going to look ahead. In relation to the bill itself, and where has there been a delay, I wanted to make sure that what we were doing in terms of giving extra powers to the RTB was giving it robust additional powers, that we weren't just giving the impression of more powers, but actually it was going to be robust. So there was a lot of back and forth between myself and the Attorney General's office to make sure that we were going to be able to do that. To have what they have in, say, a European model, recognising that we don't have the European legal system here, because we're a common law jurisdiction. So it's difficult sometimes to try and find that balance. What you have, and it speaks in a way to the question that Deputy O'Brien asked, what we have here is we are making it a criminal offence, new criminal offences for certain things, while at the same time allowing an administrative sanction to be pursued. So it'll be up for the RTB to decide, is the breach of RPZ so serious that they want to go down the criminal court's line to look for, say, a prison conviction, or is it one that can be handled now with their new administrative powers, which is the issuing of a fine, a warning, a caution, that type of thing. So what we've provided for is both. Two streams that they can follow. What's clear now, though, is that it is a criminal offence if they want to pursue it that way, or they can go down the admin line and go with fines.
When time frame wise?
In terms of the passing of that bill? Yeah. And I've been clear on this, and I hope we can achieve this. This is the first of two rent bills, and what we've tried to bring forward in this first rent bill is measures that we can all agree on, so we can get it through the House quickly. And what I hope people don't do is bring amendments in relation to other areas that we can cover that might be more complex, but that can be covered in a further bill. We need to get this done quickly, because these are important powers that are going to protect people. So I hope that now that it's published, it can be prioritised in terms of the Oireachtas schedule and through the business committee, so that we can hit the ground running in January and get it through quickly. But I'll be in the hands of the Oireachtas now in terms of time. In relation to the short-term letting, that's with the committee now. We have given you the draft guidelines. Effectively, what needs to change in legislation is very simple, primary legislation. It can happen very, very quickly. But when I lay the regulations before the House, it's a simple up or down, yes or no. It can't be amended. So what we have given is draft regulations that we hope the committee could then, with officials, go through and see, well, do these stand up? Because then I put them forward then for a standstill period that I think is 2 weeks. Then they're approved, then they're in law. We know that we have until the 1st of June to get this done, but we shouldn't wait until the last minute to get it done. But I think we should all be resolute as a committee, as an Oireachtas, to say this change is coming at the 1st of June. Nothing is going to stop this change coming, so you better be preparing. We don't want anyone coming forward on the 1st of June saying, well, we weren't ready because the law hadn't passed. This law is getting passed before then. In relation then...
Gone well over. Just to say, Darry, you weren't here for private session. We agreed that'll be the first meeting. But what I'm going to do, Minister, is because I know there's a lot which I've been able to come back on. Once we've done a full first round, I'm going to give you 10 minutes just to follow up on everybody's questions that you didn't get to answer. Is that all right? And then we go to the next round. Fergus, you're next, but you're allowing Mick to go.
Deputy Barry, if you can, in terms of time.
Do you want to speak to 10 minutes each? We'll put it together, is it?
I'll take 5 minutes max.
Correct, Fergus, yeah.
Right. First thing is that I welcome the progress of the Minister. I welcome the significant number of housing increases and start-ups and so on in my own constituency. They're very visible, they're very much there, and that's a reflection on the Minister, the Department, and obviously more focused thinking. I would like to say that I still feel that there are areas which could still be addressed, and I would like the Minister in his comments if he could address some of them. Basically, a lot of our retail section in our towns is no longer needed because of the change in retail patterns, and that that people are buying online and so on. So there's a lot of significant, certainly in Drogheda, and I know I'm sure in other places,
there's retail units which are no longer going to function into the future as retail units. And is there a plan, or can there be a plan, you know, to analyse this where it's clearly obvious and known, and to fast-track change of use? And I know that the planning permissions are much more easier to get now, but to drive that development, to appoint officers in councils, it could be part of the role of the empty homes officer to look at these properties which are vacant, which are derelict, and also properties in brownfield sites which are just derelict and gone. And I feel that could be an important focus for increased accommodation, because you have the service there, you have the water, you have the sewage, you have the footpaths, you have the lighting, you have all of the other things there. The other question I want to raise is the question of Loud. Again, I keep raising this point that very positive CPO progress there. And I am aware that other councils are doing it, but I believe they're not all doing it at the pace they ought to be doing. The question is, Minister, how can you increase pressure on councils that aren't doing their job to step up to the mark and do the business? The other issues are, this is an important point. Louth County Council, for instance, has a huge debt. They incurred, I think, 20–30 million, I don't have the exact figure, in buying land at the height of the boom, and now they're faced with servicing that debt at a crippling cost to them. Is there a question, Minister, that you might be able to aggregate those loans, be able to take some of the burden off councils like Louth County Council, so that they can focus on providing more homes, refurbishing existing homes, and that if you do that, they would have to commit to the funding that would then be released to them, you know, to concentrate on housing. And in particular on that point, it's probably the most important point I'm going to make today, is that over the last few weeks we have something like 15 people, all of them local authority tenants, whose their gas boilers have failed, and the council doesn't have the funding to replace them. And when you visit a family of 4 or 5 people with children who have disabilities, when you visit people who are sick and unwell in their homes and they can't light the fire and they have no heat, it's just not good enough. The council can do ordinary repairs, but the cost of the cost of replacing the boiler in full is a serious problem. And I would ask, Minister, that to me is hugely important, that any family, any person who is paying the rent, who are good tenants, are left in that appalling situation, and week after week they're told, yes, your top priority, but we don't have the funds. Now, they will have the funds, obviously, in the turnover in the new year, but they need that now. Can you look at that? And also, there are some other older people who are corporation or would have been tenants who can't replace their boilers. I don't know if anybody else has that problem, but it is a very serious problem for many families, and I just think that we need to find a way to assist them and help them to do it. But I welcome the sanctions that you're proposing in terms of people who don't meet the requirements under the residential tenancies. I think that criminal sanctions are an absolute deterrent, because if we're absolutely sure that you're going to be really hit on the head with a very significant fine, you won't break the law. You won't break the law, and you'll make sure that you treat your tenants in the of the small number of landlords who are in this category, that you'll obey the law and your tenants will be looked after. Final point, I support the constitutional right to housing. I think it's a good idea. I think it's just what you have to do is to balance the measure of, if a council doesn't and isn't performing its duties under such a constitutional amendment, if they're failing to act reasonably and with due consideration for the needs of the individual, then I think, if that is the law, I think that's how the Constitution would be interpreted, that it wouldn't mean that everybody gets a house just because they want one. It means that their housing needs must be met proportionately and in good time and in a fair way. And some people are not having their needs met right now, but I welcome the progress being made, Minister. Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you for your input.
Fergus, bang on 5 minutes. Mick?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Deputy O'Dowd for sharing the time. So, I want to deal with one issue only, is the question of affordable housing and what will housing cost under the affordable scheme. I think a lot of people are interested in hearing the answer to that question. So I note that the Minister has informed the committee that he intends now to publish next week the criteria for the affordable housing arrangements, I think people will be watching very carefully to see what is announced there. Now, I look at the section of the speech which deals with affordable housing. I think a key line in it is it says there will be SSF service sites funding of 50,000 per affordable home. And on this basis, at least 6,200 affordable homes could be facilitated. Now, I look at the figure of 50,000 and I see the average price of a home. In Dublin, I think the average market price would be around 380,000. You take 50,000 out of that, you come to 330,000, which is well beyond the means of a young person out of university working a couple of years, or even many workers on the average wage. Right? But I'm keen to tease out how the 50,000 will work, because the speech references that funding is available for facilitating infrastructure, to support the provision, to purchase or rent. So, am I correct in saying that that does not mean that it's a straightforward situation of its market price minus 50,000, but that the 50,000 goes on infrastructure and contributes to a lower price in a different way, if the Minister could clarify that? And, you know, to get down to the brass tacks of it, and people watching in, this is what they'll be interested in. If we were to take the examples of, say, our two biggest cities, of Dublin and Cork, under the terms of the affordable housing arrangements that you publish next week, in practical terms, for a working couple on the average wage, what do you think it will mean in terms of the price of a house in Dublin, in terms of a price of a house in Cork, and what will be knocked off the extraordinarily high and unaffordable market rates that currently exist? Sinead.
Thanks, Mick. The Minister, you have 10 minutes if the 5 of both members there.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputies, for both your questions. Deputy O'Dowd, in relation to the changing nature of our towns and villages, he's absolutely right in terms of how we need to rethink that whole Parliament. And that's why when we talk about rebuilding our housing sector, we're not trying to build it like it was before. We need to build a new one. And that means more people living in towns and centres and greater commitment to compact growth, which we have through Project Ireland 2040 and we have in Rebuilding Ireland as well. We changed the above-the-shop regs to allow people to convert above-the-shop premises into as many as nine homes and no more without the need for planning permission. It also applies to the ground level as well. A consultation was done on this and has been finished, and there's a documentation that's going to be published shortly that will give greater guidance to people in terms of doing that. The repair and lease scheme has been one way in which we've tried to pursue as well. I suppose getting derelict buildings in town centres back into use. In our urban fund that was launched, Chair, very recently, the first round of the 100 million, somewhere in the region of 20 to 30%, might be around 27% if I can remember correctly, was used for those kind of integrated projects that would bring about living in town and village centres again. And we have a process underway in relation to the use of private CPOs, or sorry, CPOing properties, not for social housing use, but then to sell back again into private use. I know there's a couple of pilots that are being looked at potentially doing around that, because we have to make sure, I think, when we look at certain villages and towns, they aren't going to have potentially the retail or high street that they had in the past, because the way that just the economy is changing. And so there are properties that could and should be used for housing because of the infrastructure that's already in place and because of the benefits that come from that kind of community living. In relation to CPOs more generally, we do have our vacancy teams in place. Now, we do know that vacancy isn't as high as people previously thought, and we have much better information now thanks to the recent Intercon report, but we also have our local authority teams identifying vacant units. We have a number of projects underway, I think it's 6 local authorities, and they are now starting to drill down into what is actually vacant as opposed to what appears to be vacant. And we want them to move now to CPO those properties, or at least get into that process. We are awaiting advice from the CNAG in relation to a more enhanced CPO, again around that private side. And I know that Justice is leading on reforming our CPOs more generally, based on recommendations of the Law Reform Commission. In relation to land debt, we did do this previously in relation to the first phase of LAGs. We have written to LAG specifically, the Deputy might not know this, we have written to LAG specifically around land debt issues that they have themselves to see what we can do to make sure that it's not impacting upon their ability to deliver housing. But, you know, we do have problems in some local authorities where the land that is in debt and does have repayments being made on it in terms of the interest, where that land isn't suitable for housing. So that's a tougher nut to crack, but we are looking at potential ways in which we can look at that. The local property tax review has been completed on our side in terms of allocations to local authorities. And we're just waiting to complete the second piece of work, which is in relation to the work that we're doing with finance. But what that will mean is that we will see houses that have been built in the past few years that aren't liable to LBT coming into that net, which will mean we'll be able to increase allocations to local authorities based on new criteria that have been designed, and we'll be announcing that when we're ready to go with the second piece of the LPT. In relation to gas boilers, I mean, you know, €35 million has been spent this year on energy efficiency, or at least has been allocated to be spent on energy efficiency this year. If LAD has a particular problem around boilers and replacement of boilers, they should contact us directly. Obviously, we should be replacing boilers when they need to be replaced, and we shouldn't be waiting unnecessarily for the passing of 2 or 3 weeks. Obviously, budgetary limits in a year and capital ceilings, etc., and that type of spending obviously is done on a year-on-year basis, and it's important that we're not in breach of those. But, you know, when it comes to replacement of gas boilers or a few gas boilers, it's not a huge amount of money. I'm sure something can be done. So I would ask that LAG would contact us directly on that, and maybe the Deputy can facilitate in that. I don't know why they haven't, if this is as much of a concern as the Deputy makes it out to be. In relation to the rent bill, I welcome the fact that the Deputy welcomed that we are looking at, that we are going to introduce new criminal sanctions, but also these administrative sanctions so that the RTB can move directly itself to sanction landlords that it finds to be in breach of their obligations, rogue landlords. Deputy Barry, in relation to your questions around affordability, so one of the things that I was keen to stress in the opening statement, and you know, it's shorter than I'd like it to be, just for the case of not boring everyone with too long an opening statement, but that, you know, what we have done in this week, we have now published the first 2 kind of lists of sites that we're moving on with affordability. So we know the sites in terms of Table A that are agreed in principle now to be developed for affordable housing, and the number of homes that can be derived from that in terms of these subsidised housing schemes. We have a second table of sites that we're working on with those local authorities, and we have every other local authority doing an economic assessment as to how they're going to deliver and take advantage of the fund that we have. We know, more generally speaking, in terms of affordability, that 1 in 2 first-time buyers in 12 months up to June bought their homes for less than €250,000. So we know that affordability is not an issue in every part of the country, and I think you alluded to that yourself. But that doesn't mean that we can't have the subsidised housing schemes under the Service Sites Fund being delivered in many more local authorities than Cork and Dublin, and that's why we have the second table, and that's why we're asking other local authorities to do their own economic assessment. So when we look at the 50,000 and it's an average amount, not every home on a site will need 50,000 worth of infrastructural works being done to open up that site for delivery. But what we're talking about here is, if a local authority has its own land and owns that land, then what is the cost of building that house in terms of contracting in a person to build that house on that site? Because obviously the local authority doesn't build itself directly in terms of having its own builders hired directly to it. And then what are the costs of servicing that site? So the ancillary costs, be they in relation to different types of infrastructure, maybe it's an entrance road, maybe it's roads within the site, lighting, water, wastewater, those types of things, and the cost of doing that. Then is a housing body going to be involved? More than likely it will be involved in terms of then managing aspects of that. And then what's the value of the land? If the value of the land was at the market, and it's the value of the land and the amount that goes into servicing the site that can then be discounted from the final delivery price. And what we've put in place is certain caps in relation to that discounted price being no more than 40% of the cost of the house, so that when the local authority takes its equity share, which is to be repaid, because again, this is kind of a cooperative approach whereby the local authority and the purchaser come together to buy the house, and part of the mortgage, if you like, is parked in terms of the local authority having it. That has to be repaid over time. That will then give us the price of the house in terms of what the person buying it is going to pay. So it's not a case of just looking at, well, what's the market value in Dún Laoghaire, discount 50,000. That's not how we're doing it. and then we've put other caps in place in terms of.
Basically, what it is if the developer was to pass on the full cost or the full value of what's covered by the SSF, it would tend on average to result in an approximate 50,000 reduction. So say for Dublin, if it was 378, it would bring you down to 330. Is that the way that it works?
No. We'd be discounting both the cost of servicing the site, but also the notional value of the land if it was private land going on the market. And we'd take those two figures together and we would discount that. But the maximum discount available is 40% over what the price might be on the market.
Okay.
So if you've had a house, for example, at 400 grand on the market, potentially the discount could be 40%. But that is an equity stake.
Gotcha.
Okay. Though. So
exactly.
As you said, the land cost is factored into.
Yeah.
So.
Richard.
Thanks. And thanks to the Minister and his team for their report.
Shout out I gave him very kindly on Monday.
I noticed that.
Yeah, no, it was. Gave him a very big hug.
That was probably the point of it. Okay.
Trying to soften you up, Richard.
Yeah, I know. But there's no chance of that.
No chance.
At all.
Deputy Barry, I know there's no chance of that.
Right. First point I want to make. This is a point that Mel Reynolds, because I always give credit where credit is due. Mel Reynolds pointed this out to me, and it's a pretty serious matter, Minister, is the very significant discrepancy between the output figures for local authority output in 2017 between what you're claiming and what's in the NOAC report. The NOAC is the National Oversight and Audit Commission report, which was published in September 2018. And this, to me, exposes what I think is a bit of the spin that's going on about output. Because according to your housing delivery for 2017, the total number of houses added to the local authority stock was 4,269. But when you go to the National Oversight and Audit Commission, the figure is shown to be 2,019. In other words, more than 50% less new local authority stock than what you're claiming. And the NOAC report, you see the difference is, it does a very simple thing. It says, what was the total local authority housing stock at the beginning of 2017, and what was the total local authority housing stock at the end of 2017, and you subtract one from the other. Now, how do you explain this discrepancy? And it's a very significant discrepancy, and it has very, very big implications for all of your targets, not just for 2017, but for every single year out to 2021. And if the point is valid, we've really, there's some very serious questions to answer. And what seems to be at the bottom of the discrepancy is that we have essentially miscounting or double counting going on in terms of sales of local authority housing, demolitions, and critically voids being double counted. And this is a point I raised with Brendan Kenny, and he more or less acknowledged the point, right? Which is, void implies something that's been sitting empty for absolutely ages, and we do work and we finally get it back into use. Fine if it's a genuine void. But if in fact a void is just a casual turnover, then there's a big difference, right? I put it to you that those casual turnovers are being counted in your claims for output as new local authority housing stock when they're not. I mean, if you look at the Dublin City targets that Brendan Kenny showed us, he has 1,000 voids roughly every year for most of the duration of Rebuilding Ireland. That's preposterous, because that would suggest if you read it on face value, that there's 4,000 or 5,000 voids in the hands of Dublin City Council. Of course there's not. We know there's some, but it's not that many. Right, so what we're actually counting is casual, turnovers or vacancies, right? So I would like that point addressed, because if the actual additional local authority housing stock is half of what has been claimed, then that needs to be admitted, and admitted honestly. And indeed, in Dublin, the NOAC report suggests that in the year 2017 there was only 564. In all 4 Dublin local authority areas, that there was only an additional 564 units of housing stock for the whole of 2017. That's my first point. Second point is on the issue of sort of price. That we were out at Cherrywood, okay? Now, I talked to the guy, Hines. Unusual enough for me to be talking to these capitalists.
You look very comfortable, by the way, in the conversation.
I tell you,
sorry, Sharon.
Or, Richard, just be careful about naming people outside the houses.
I didn't name him. I just said the guy from Hines. The guy from Hines.
I don't think he'll mind being called capitalist.
You weren't here.
Wearing his badge of honour.
I just said the guy. There's a lot.
Sorry, members, in all due respect.
Yeah.
Richard, you weren't here when I read the note on privilege. It's up to you what you say, but I'm just reminding you about the note on privilege.
Sure. Well, I didn't name anybody. Anyway, he said that the cost of the units that they intend to deliver later than expected, 26 months for the first phase, which is a long time out, later than expected. The cost of building them, he said, was around 400,000 a unit for these apartments. They'll be mostly apartments. Now, if they're costing him 400,000, what are they going to cost to people in the area? Well, whatever it is, it's going to be in excess of 400,000, and that is totally unaffordable for the vast majority of people who are affected by the current housing crisis. Whether they're, working people on average earnings or whatever, right up to probably, 70, 80,000 euro a year. That's just way beyond. So I asked the question, like, what the hell is the point in that? What is the point in that stuff? So we have fanfare about the delivery of the biggest residential development in the state, but the vast bulk of it is going to be totally unaffordable. So I just want to know, what do you say about that? The other thing that just struck me, right, and I find it slightly worrying, is outside the window where we were, there were trucks, and I went down afterwards, there were trucks with lights flashing, and there was a crane, or a digger. And I went down and I just had a look to see what it was doing, right? And it was doing absolutely nothing. It was literally waving its arm around and moving a few stones from one place to another, because actually nothing was happening on the site. Nothing. But this was done for the optics of the cameras. And the point is, they have been sitting on that site for years, and then we discovered that the latest date they're giving us is 26 months. And I go, what the hell is happening here?
Richard, do you want the Minister to answer you?
I'll finish.
Okay,
I'll come back later on another point.
Minister.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Deputy, for the questions. I think we need to be really careful when we talk about numbers, and we don't inadvertently, if you're trying to make, say, a political charge against me, actually end up undermining. But end up undermining the system that we have here in terms of the permanent government, the civil service, the department. I mean, if we're going to spend money on housing and give numbers then in terms of the number of houses that are delivered through a build programme, those numbers are verified not just by the actual houses that are built and where they are, but through a whole system of accounting that goes and falls to the accounting officer and the different reporting that he has to do, the different checks and balances that happen with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform and everyone else. So, we have to be careful to make sure that in having political charges against each other, whether what we define as a void or what's not a void, that we don't inadvertently target the actual system that supports all of us in terms of actually delivering public services for the public good. And what bothers me with some commentators, and I'm not going to name anyone, but some commentators who are fully aware that we have a number of different streams to increase the stock of social housing, not just one stream, but a number of different streams, will cherry-pick certain numbers or certain streams, compare them to others, and say something's not adding up, and they will create confusion. Even those, we've invited in different commentators and economists who are working publicly in this area into the department on numerous occasions to explain through Rebuilding Ireland the different delivery streams that we have. Some continue to do that. They continue to measure just local authority build against our social housing stock increases or our social housing build, which includes other streams of delivery because it's more prudent to do that. We should have, we should spread out our streams of delivery for social housing. Should one then come into difficulty, we won't then have no social houses being built. And that's been an approach that we've taken under Rebuilding Ireland to protect the delivery of social housing into the future from future shocks. If you look at the NOAC report, and I met with the new chair of NOAC yesterday to go through a number of issues in relation to NOAC, because I think that NOAC is a new invention. It's 4 years old now, but I think there's a lot more that NOAC can do in terms of giving people greater faith and trust in terms of what's happening at a local level in terms of spending, because we often hear about how a local authority, for example, may have defaulted with revenue. People go, how did that happen and what's going on there? And to have those things properly aired at a national level, I think NOAC has a great role to tell people what's actually happened there, so they can continue to have faith in their local authority. But the NOAC report doesn't count the increase in stock that's delivered through housing bodies, which are working with us in tandem, using public money to increase the stock of social housing. And it doesn't include houses that are delivered through the Part 5 process, which are homes that we then get into the stock of social housing. These are social housing homes. It used to be that Part 5 was essentially the only delivery mechanism that we had. Now we've got many more, thankfully. So when we look at the numbers, and when we publish our numbers under Rebuilding Ireland, like it's the state, it's the government of Ireland producing numbers. It'd be a whole different thing if the Minister for Housing was getting a number and saying, look, just double that number there, will you? Or look, I'll change the press release with this number or whatever. That would be, that's a political charge you make against me, and I know you're not making that charge. But when we count the numbers, in the department, when we publish our information, we are very clear to make sure that we're publishing accurate information in terms of what is spent and what is being delivered in terms of the stock of social housing. But that is the difference between what the NOAC has and what we publish. And there is a difference. And people should point that difference out when they're talking to it publicly. If an expert, a so-called expert on housing, is talking about the stock of social housing, they should point out what they're not counting and be fair to what is actually being done and be fair to the progress that is being made under Rebuilding Ireland. Not everything is moving in the right direction. Of course it's not. The number of people in emergency accommodation tells us that. The numbers when we look at things like repair and leasing scheme tell us that, and I have numbers from a previous question that I can give in just a moment. Voids aren't being double counted. They're not allowed to be double counted in the funding line that we have. And we aren't talking about casual vacancies. We're talking about houses that need upwards of €30,000 to get them back into use. There was, unfortunately, a bit of a perverse incentive in having a long-term vacancy and a short-term vacancy when it came to social housing, in that the fear was that some local authorities, unable to get more funding, would allow a house to be vacant longer than it should be. And we don't want that happening either. As we get these voids back into use, we then, and it's happening now as we move towards the end of Rebuilding Ireland for the next 2 years, funding will go towards maintaining the stock. Funding will go towards making sure that casual vacancies or short-term vacancies are short-term, and it's not taking forever to get that house let again. But voids are not double counted, and they can't be double counted under the programme. And we separate voids out from our delivery as well. We have separated voids out. It's one of the things I wanted to do, is to make sure that when we talk about over 4,000 homes in the social housing stock this year, it's not including voids. When we talk about more than 6,000 next year, it's not including voids. I think that's important as well in terms of, again, transparency, accountability, and everyone knowing exactly what we're delivering, what we're trying to deliver. In relation to Cherrywood, I think it's fantastic. I mean, what's going to happen there is like more than 23,000 people will come to live in Cherrywood, between more than 9,000 homes. I mean, this is a new town. It's huge. And I think it's incorrect to say that nothing is happening there. Look at all the roads. Look at the Lewis going through, the buses going through, the water, the wastewater, the lighting, the sports pitches, the tennis pitches, tennis courts. And now they're ready to build, and now they've gotten commencement, and now they're going on site and they're building. And it's important that they will build. Yes, the cost is high in delivering apartments there because of the amount of money that has been spent on all this excellent infrastructure that will serve the communities there. They're going for the build-to-rent model, which is different than in terms of the cost of owning and buying. We need more build-to-rent. I think it's important. The standards are better for apartments. That means that they're more expensive, but we've worked to help cut costs so that in an area like Cherrywood, the default would be no car parking spaces in an apartment block, or just a few to cater for visitors or for those people that might have needs for a car permanently. When you've got 5 Lewis stops running through Cherrywood, and you've got the Dublin bus network already going across the site. You've got great transport infrastructure, so you don't need things like car parking spaces. Also, the new build-to-rent guidelines are going to help them in future planning applications that come forward, drive those costs down as well. 10% of housing that will be delivered will be affordable, will be social, and we have the affordability dividend coming from LIAF as well. But the basic point, I think, in all of everything that we do is, fundamentally, we need the delivery of supply. If new homes aren't being built, there's no point talking about how much they're going to cost to buy or to rent, or what percentage will be affordable, or social, I mean, if they're not actually being built. And what we need to make sure is that we are catering for housing for everyone. And you can be sure, if you looked at the 25,000 homes that will be built next year, around 25,000 we hope, Central Bank thinks it's more around 24,000, we'll know at the end of next year. You know, at least 6,000 of those built will be social housing homes built. And for the remainder, that is a very important new homes for families up and down the country, which will all be bought. Some will be bought at a very high range because people can afford to buy at that price level, but not all of them. And again, I go back to first-time buyers. 1 in 2 up to 12 months up to June buying their house for less than €250,000. So in parts of the country, affordability isn't an issue. But also now, we're seeing that residential construction is now driving the growth in commercial construction. We're also seeing the slowest pace of house price increases in the last 2 years. So these aspects of the rebuilding are working, and they are helping people. And then in relation to, sorry, your last question was, Chair. Thank you.
Minister, I'm going to give you, because that's the end of round one, I'm going to give you 10 minutes just to come back on some of the questions you didn't get to answer because of time.
Just one thing, if I just ask the Minister to be helpful here, maybe you might just sort of fill us in more detail in relation to your response about Shanganagh Castle, because the request I'm only making one simple ask of you that you commissioned yourself to doing before is to bring in all the stakeholders and parties together early in the year. I think it's really important that happens. That's the desire of the elected members of Dunleary Down County Council. It's a commitment you gave on the record to the committee to Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett. You have three TDs in that constituency. For it's a remarkable achievement to have, and they clearly are very committed to it too. And so I think for a whole range of reasons, I think your staff, Philomena Poole, the Chief Executive of Dunleary, and her staff, and the elected members, I think it's important we're all on track, we're all on the same message, we're hearing the same story and the same response, but more importantly, ruling out this possibility that we won't have a house there till 2022 it's totally unacceptable. We need construction there in 2019, but maybe you might flesh out that and give us a commitment, if you would, today to early in January meet with all of these stakeholders. Thanks.
Thanks, Victor. Minister, I'll give you 10 minutes without interruption, and then we'll come back to you.
Thanks, Chair. Senator, on that kind of last point, but I know you were in earlier on this point, so I'll come back to you first. That's absolutely no problem. But I want people to be assured that, you know, work has continued. It's not that nothing is happening. The NDFA has been working with the local authority to try and get the financial model right. I have my staff out again there today, meeting to see what further work can be done. I did raise it with the EIB when they were in Dublin last week at a conference. So it's absolutely a priority as far as the department is concerned. The delivery board is in place. I think that perhaps the meeting should be with the delivery board, and we can do that in January. That's not a problem at all. Yeah, no, but you know, I mean, like, this is a site we want delivered. I mean, we're for housing with the Department of Housing, so you know, what we want to make sure is that there are no unnecessary delays or blockages. We also want to make sure that we get it right. We don't want this to proceed through the various stages and processes and then fail at the last minute because the financial modelling was rushed. I know a lot has been done, but the NDFA are experts on this, Senator. If it was as simple as saying, yeah, okay, the numbers work, that would have happened by now. So obviously there was a problem with the financial modelling that still needs to be resolved. In relation to Deputy O'Brien, the questions that I didn't get to that you asked, sorry now, the constitutional right to housing. So I think the first thing to point to on a constitutional right to housing is that putting a constitutional right to housing into the Constitution or putting a law in place is not going to get in the way of us building houses. It's not going to get in the way of us completing Rebuilding Ireland. It's not going to get in the way of us moving then into the National Development Plan, part of Project Ireland 2040. That commitment, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 homes every year that is being built, being a home that's going into the social housing stock. All of those many important things that we need to do around affordability that can be delivered now because we've got specific funding lines and we now have the first agreed in principle sites under the Service Sites Fund. So I think it's important I know we understand that, but for the public to understand that the fact that there is not a constitutional right to housing or a legal piece of legislation that says that there is a right to housing is not stopping us from delivering. And the delivery in terms of supply is ramping up quite dramatically. As to whether or not there needs to be a constitutional protection in the Constitution, I mean, that process is now being handled by a separate committee looking at different socio-economic rights and how we achieve that balance in society. Is it through constitutional amendment? Is it through legislation? And people have different views on this in terms of, and I heard Deputy O'Dowd debating this on the radio with Eamon Delaney from the Hibernian Institute about what is the role of a constitution, what is it actually meant to enshrine? And in recent conversations I've had with some people around a referendum on the public ownership of water, it's now moved in part from being a debate on whether or not it should be in the Constitution, but which part of the Constitution, because certain parts are stronger than others. Well, I spoke to the AG about this. That's nonsense. The Constitution is the Constitution. But the Constitution is not the place to put in, is not the appropriate body in which to enshrine every single law or right. And we need to come to an understanding at some point as to what is the role of the Constitution as we go through this transformative piece in our history where so much change and positive change is happening, and the Constitution is the vehicle for that change. I am open-minded as to whether or not we need to put a constitutional right to housing into the Constitution. I can't speak for the Taoiseach, but I think he is also open-minded. So government policy, government isn't set in a direction on this. We are engaged in a process that has done the public good in terms of marriage equality and in terms of repealing the 8th Amendment. And we are going to continue with that process, which is the Oireachtas Committee engagement, insofar as it coming to a determination as to what the next step is in this debate that we're having, this public debate. But to return to my previous point, it's not getting in the way of delivery. If I felt it was getting in the way of delivery, I think we'd be having a separate conversation. If I felt that the lack of a law at the moment was getting in the way of delivery, we'd be having a separate conversation around constitutional rights. You asked about the Residential Tenancies Board and the powers that are coming under the legislation that's now published. We have allowed for two tracks, and it will be up for the RTB to decide. We'll be addressing this at second stage, but I'll go through very quickly how it's envisaged, just from some notes that I was making on this before second stage, in terms of the sanctioning regime. So, you know, a complaint will be made or will be discovered by the RTB. An inspector will be appointed to investigate that complaint. As part of that inspection process, the landlord will have a right to make their views known as to what they think of that complaint. There will be an independent panel of decision makers appointed by the RTB, and that report will go to a person on that panel, a decision maker, as they'll be referred to in the legislation. And they will then make a decision as to what should the sanction be, what the pursuit should be. That will go to the RTB board for a decision, and they will formally issue the decision, but it will be made by the decision maker following a recommendation from the inspector. And the landlord then accepts that or doesn't and challenges it. But effectively, that decision maker will be able to decide, because we're allowing for new criminal offences, does this warrant criminal pursuit of the landlord through the courts? You know, because they have breached one of these new offences in relation to not cooperating with an inspection, not adhering to the rent pressure zone, not registering the tenancy, or, you know, getting around or trying to get around RBZs by using substantial change in the wrong way. Or is it such that they go through the administrative civil sanction route, which is also provided for in the legislation, which is the fine of up to €15,000 and the recovery of costs up to €15,000, and the publishing then of that person's name on the website or in the papers. It'll be up to the decision maker to decide, and then for the RTB to sanction, which is the preferred route. But we've allowed for both to make sure that we are really giving a new power to the RTB, that we are cutting out any unnecessary time delays by giving it an administrative sanction, but also that we are saying to the RTB, if this breach is so severe, this landlord, and we see it from time to time, these rogue landlords who are doing despicable things, and they shouldn't be called landlords, they're effectively breaching people's human rights. If it's that level of injustice that allow them to go the criminal route to try and, if they think they should, try and get a prison sentence or whatever else. So we've allowed for both in the legislation under the new RTB bill, which is published, and which, if we all have agreement on the proposed way forward, and I think we do from pre-light scrutiny and other things that have happened, we can move very quickly through the House if the Oireachtas Committee schedules that. We talked about Deputy O'Brien. Where do we leave it with you? Rebuilding Ireland assessment, yes. So the assessment of Rebuilding Ireland has been completed. I got a couple of people independent from the department to come into the department to do a piece of work on that and see, well, where do we think that the home loan could be improved. I think it's important to say that not all the applications received were valid. So when we look at actual assessed applications, the valid ones, of the 2,850 that have been assessed, 1,452 have been recommended for approval by the housing agencies. That's 51%, half. It then falls to the credit committee and the local authority to then say yes or no with the loan. The total drawdown to date is €47.6 million in terms of actual loans being drawn down from that 200 million tranche, so almost 25%. Now, this was only opened in February of this year, and anyone who's been through the mortgage process knows that it does take time to actually find the house you want to buy, get the sale agreed, get through that process and everything else. But the expected end-of-year drawdown is approaching 92.1 million. So, at the end of this year, 1 million, based on what we have on our tables in terms of the information that's coming in. So this is, we all know how popular a product this is in terms of people wanting to get this fixed interest mortgage over the lifetime of the loan. I don't know if you've been fortunate enough to meet people who've availed of it.
Yes.
Wow, it makes a huge difference to their lives, right? Like it's a nice meeting to have.
Also met people who've been refused. But
right, that's a different meeting to have.
Which also is life-changing for them too.
No, of course. But what we're trying to do with the assessment now is to see, well, how do we improve it, and are there other criteria that we want to just widen it a little bit to include? And that work is ongoing, but it does involve engagement with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. It doesn't fall solely to my department.
Can I come in on that now? No? At the end, sorry, at the end.
Without
Okay,
interruption,
that's fine.
then,
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
So, like, I know initially people were worried about this loan, was it going to show the kind of progress that we need, but when you think about how long it actually takes to actually buy a house, you look at the drawdowns now happening, this thing is working, and working very well. If you look at the repair and lease scheme, I think was the next set of questions that you had, Deputy O'Brien. The figures I have on the repair and lease scheme.
Yeah, I asked it.
Sorry.
Yeah, he's O'Brien.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I know. Look, you're always giving out to me, but I beg your No. I can say Owen and Dara. I mean,
Yeah, well,
we're
you
going to
can
get
do that
offended.
too.
We drop
Yeah,
the
but then which
yeah.
Owen? You see, sometimes it's difficult to
Well, I'm not going to talk to myself. Well, not in front of you, anyway. We've had 1,000 applications in the repair and lease scheme as of Q3 of this year. 100 agreements for lease have been signed, and we've had 39 to date solely in 2018, and we know the delivery in 2017 was very poor with 9. But we have 100 leased, we have 100 applications that we're working through, and our vacant housing offices are kind of prioritising that as part of vacancy. It's a good concept, but I think the more and more that I look at individual projects that are coming under repair and lease, it's a very unique set of circumstances for someone. You need to own a second home that you are not using. It needs to be in a state of disrepair. You need to not have the funds to be able to bring it back into use, or not want to use the funds in that way, and you need to be willing then to give it over to social housing, and there needs to be a social housing need in that area. So, like, while we need to have it there as part of our armoury in terms of getting vacancy back into use, like, it may not be what we thought it was going to be initially, but we are seeing greater progress through the system in terms of the repair and leasing scheme. What we have seen is more take-up in terms of buy and renew instead, actually. As people come and engage on the RLS, they then actually fall into buy and renew because they go, you know what, actually, we'll sell it to you and you can renew it and we'll just take it off. You can take it off our hands. So that is working well. In relation to, that is working better, and we continue to drive it. AHBs and reclassification was another point that you raised. Now, this actually came up at the European Investment Bank conference that was held in the Central Bank last week, and we had over the name of a huge housing body from Scotland. Like, it's bigger than any of our tier 3s. Actually, it might be as big as our 3 tier 3s combined. And the reclassification issue was touched upon in terms of how it affected the UK. We have had now the ruling in relation to some of our larger housing bodies, not all of them, but some of them, and we're working through that. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to have that led by finance to make it quite clear to the industry that this is an accounting issue, it's not a delivery issue, and it's not going to impact upon delivery. So that committee continues to do its work. It continues to engage with Eurostat and with the Commission. I have raised it in each of my engagements with the EIB because as we look to new lending streams from them, on balance sheet, off balance sheet, state aid, all of these things, classification is very important. And while they are not the classification body of the EU, obviously, they have good expertise in this area. So we continue to look at it. We continue to see how we can make sure that we can, work to it without it impacting on delivery, and it won't impact on delivery. And the important thing is that the lead body for housing bodies has also given a commitment that it will do what it needs to do to make sure that the classification issues don't impact upon delivery from its point of view and delivery of finance and the raising of finance and everything else. And we'll be progressing this in tandem with progressing the bill next year in terms of trying to come to a more certain outcome. But sometimes these engagements do take time with the Commission, and sometimes that's to our interest as well, in terms of what we're doing right now on the ground in terms of delivery.
Just wondering though, are we still fighting the good fight on it, or have we taken it that it's just going to be on balance sheet for good? Or are we having those discussions in relation to the classification?
We are not taking it that it's going to be on balance sheet for good. I mean, one of the indications of that is that not all of the tier 3s were told that they're going to have to come on balance sheet. So that shows that there are ways around this that may be able to be dealt with in the regulation bill that's coming through, and we continue to look at that to see, what can be done there. So we'll continue to fight that good fight. But the most important message, I think, from all of us is to housing bodies, you've got a delivery stream under Rebuilding Ireland, and we are absolutely determined to make sure that you deliver it, and you will, and we will, and we'll do that. And this classification issue, which is an accounting issue, is not going to get in the way. In relation to Rapid, that hasn't been shelved. It's a very unfortunate name. What we're talking about is prefabricated housing off-site, so that when it gets on-site, the actual on-site piece of housing delivery happens much more quickly. It doesn't mean that we're short-circuiting things like planning, architectural design, procurement processes, approval processes for money from the department.
What would you call it then? Not rapid build.
Super rapid? Double down?
It's okay, we're not getting back and forth because we're well over time and we need to go into the second round.
So it's not shelved, but the delays that we're seeing are not necessarily at the actual on-site side. Some of the delays are getting local authorities to actually use this delivery method. And what I really hope is that the new procurement framework, which Dublin City Council is pioneering for modular, volumetric modular, is going to open the way for other local authorities to use it as well. We are seeing huge interest from companies on the private side. This is happening on the private side of delivery. I have companies coming to me saying, Minister, if you can just give us a contract, we'll open the factory off the M50 and we'll start producing thousands of these things. There's two problems there. One, I can't do that because of procurement law. And I've looked to break procurement law, and I haven't been allowed to do that. The EU law on this is incredibly tight. We cannot break procurement law, even though we have a crisis in homelessness, and even though we know we need to ramp up the delivery of housing. And the second issue around that is, even if I could break procurement law, we would still have to go through proper planning and that process, and make sure that what we are doing is being built in the right place, being built to the right spec, and isn't going to have us in 30 years' time going, why did we do that? And having a future crisis. And again, we're trying to protect ourselves from future crises. And just one more thing, as I remember it, because I look at my notes on the reclassification issue in housing bodies, I think there might be, one other country that might have been caught in this has either said publicly or is considering pursuing this through the ECJ, which would then have a pause effect on aspects of it. Which, again, I know we want to have clarity on this, but sometimes a lack of clarity can be helpful in the present term in terms of just driving through delivery and getting things done. But we'll continue to be mindful of our obligations to deal with this classification issue as a classification issue, while we bring forward the regulation bill next year, and while we continue to drive delivery for housing bodies. I think that's all of the outstanding questions as I had them, but I didn't get to them, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. So we're going to, because we've very little time left, we're going to go into quick fire. So we've got 3 minutes a member, if that's okay. So Owen, you're first, Victor, Dara, then Richard. Owen.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, just to go back to the social housing output report. So on the basis of the figures you've given us, only 35% of the new bills have been delivered as of Q3. So that means you have 65% to deliver in the final quarter. That does seem very worrying. And I know we don't know what's going to be the final output until the end of the year. but to have to deliver or complete 65% of the target in 3 months does seem to me a very, very big ask. So I suppose, how reassured are you at this stage that you'll be coming back to us in January, early February with 100% delivery on the new builds? I will also make the point, and it's to pick up on Richard, Brendan Kenny, when he was in with us in committee, and you can check the transcript, made it very clear that he doesn't count the expensive casual vacancies as voids. What I would ask you to do is consider just taking them out of the output report. I think it's very helpful that you count them separately, and I accept the legitimacy of doing that, but they're not additions to the stock anymore. They were at an earlier stage in the programme, they're now not. And I'm not challenging anybody here other than to say, I think the void programme has now become something different to what it was, and while it's useful to have the figure, I don't think it should be in the output report. On the RTB, and again, the information you provided is helpful. Can you just clarify, under the proposals in the legislation, which obviously we haven't seen yet, are you saying that the RTB would have the power to impose fines on landlords in breach of rent reviews and rent pressure zones without having to go to the courts? So is there a sanction, a civil sanction, to issue a fine? I would also caution, however, about too much referrals to the board. The RTB used to have about 88 board meetings a year because of the volume of board decisions. That has been dramatically reduced, which has made it more efficient. So I would have a concern around that. Minister, then on cost rental, one of the concerns I have is we still don't know what the start-off rents are going to be. We've been told in Enniskerry Road it could be about 80% of market rent. Part of the financing problem is if you've got an EIB loan, for example, or a private sector loan over 25 years, that means if you want to pay that loan down plus the management and maintenance of the unit, your start-off rents have to be quite high. If you were able to combine an EIB loan over a 25-year period with a capital advance loan facility from the state for another, say, 10 years after that, you could significantly reduce the start-off rents. I asked you in a parliamentary question recently, would you be willing to look at amending the capital advance loan facility arrangements to allow such a loan, not unlike how it currently works, 30% of the loan value, and for that to be paid down after the IB loan? That would bring down your start-off rents from over €1,000 to closer to 700 or 800 euros, eminently more affordable. I would have thought it was something you would have considered in the budget recently, and I'd ask you to look at it again. On the service size fund, I'm a little confused on the basis of the report in front of us, because most of us had thought the service size fund was to be the O'Coulon model, right? So there was no reference to market prices and a deduction. It was discounting for the local authority the cost of land and site servicing and selling the property, at close to the economic cost of producing it. From the report that's in front of us, it looks now a little bit more like the local infrastructure housing activation fund. So again, if you can just maybe give us a little bit more detail on that. And then finally, on the home loans, just to pick up on Dara's point, there were 2,222 loans underwritten as of the end of September. 1,134 of those were approved. My understanding is when we get the figures, you're looking at a drawdown of about 200 at the end of September. Now, I know it's still within the first year, so we need to be cautious about drawing conclusions. But if you have over 2,000 indicative approvals and 1,000 formal approvals, but only 200 drawdowns, is that not a cause for concern? And can you give us any indication as to why the drawdown is, less than 10% of those people who are eligible to apply, and about 20% of those who are approved?
Victor.
Okay, Minister, I'm just going to keep it short. First, I want to welcome and thank you for the commitment you've given us today in relation to next week publishing the criteria for the affordable housing scheme. It is long overdue. And I suppose when you look back, and anyone looking in here today or looking back at the webcast of this meeting, they'll be conscious of the fact, it's addressing homelessness. This was one of the key objectives we had here. Accelerating social housing, building more homes, improving rental sector and utilising existing housing. And I want to draw your attention to something in your report that you've circulated to us, which is 516, which talks about a pilot scheme of 6 local authorities. Now, it says complete here. And then if you read your own commentary, it's not you're waiting a pilot scheme of 6 local authorities. So I'd like if you could circulate that to us. What is the pilot scheme? I mean, we've a lot of local authorities. The objective was we will ensure that vacant homes and action plan are put in place across all of the local authorities. So there was this pilot scheme, and I know you don't have time to go into it today, but you might elaborate on it and send it to us, in the coming days. Secondly, I just want to ask if you could give a commitment, because you're leading this department. We have time and time in this committee, as I understand this, correspondence went out to you last week or the week before, again, requesting that all circulars that are issued would be sent to the committee. The more we're informed of what's going on, because there's a deficit of information here, and I know we've requested this on 2, if not 3 occasions from your department. We actually want a response, and I'd like to ask that you would formally respond to the correspondence to the committee, if you haven't already done so, and you give a commitment that these circulars would be issued, and then finally...
No, Victor, just to have confirmed that they will do that.
Okay, that's great. No, I think we've already done it. We're in the process of doing it. Okay, but we have asked before, and then this local authority, and finally, this local authority assessment of affordable housing. You don't need to be told that affordability is a major issue in most local authorities. It's certainly in all the 4 local authorities in Dublin, it's in Galway, Limerick, and you're telling me that you're still awaiting assessments. You don't need, you're long enough in this business to know, you do not need a document telling you about the assessments of affordability. Is this a delaying tactic? What is the reason? Can you tell me what is the current status of the 4 Dublin local authorities in relation to reporting back on this assessment of affordable accommodation? And if it's not with you and you don't know, why isn't it with you and why don't you know? Because I've spoken to the people involved in these 4 local authorities, and they cannot understand this insistence on having this report when you and everyone in your department knows there is an affordable issue. But look, if that's a process you want to be done, if you want those boxes ticked, just tell us how that's progressing, will you?
Okay, thank you. Dara?
Yeah, just a couple of things to return to. Again, I just make the point in relation to HAP. When you look at the figures this year, 4,506 homes either built or voids coming back or acquisition or leasing, 14,275 through HAP. You know, it remains a serious concern for me on the over-reliance on that sector, and I understand we have to keep those tenancies going. That's why we agreed the additional funding in the budget when you've entered into it, but it is not, in my view, a long-term housing solution for families. Can I turn to 2 things? On the Rebuilding Ireland affordable loans, it is a good model, it's a good product. I think that I would just urge you to speed up that review. I have evidence which I've sent in as well from across the country of very different criteria used for underwriting, particularly on the financial side, and what's taken into account as income, is overtime taken into account, or bonus taken into account. So it needs to be streamlined. I'm aware it's new, so I'm not going to beat you up over the figures. I'm glad to see it increasing. It is a good product, and I would say that the refusal rate still remains very high. I'm saying that as someone who worked in financial services in my previous life. I'm very familiar with mortgages as well. A 50% refusal rate is a high refusal rate. That's not just, and I think we need to strip out those that are invalidated or incomplete versus what we've refused from a financial underwriting perspective. Can I ask you just about the discretionary cap, the 2 million cap that has been raised to 6 million at the budget for local authorities for social house building by local authorities, but effectively something that we insisted upon on the budget to give more autonomy to the local authorities. Do you see that coming into force from the 1st of January? Has your department been in contact with the local authorities to advise them of that? One of the reasons Fianna Fáil sought that was to try to move away as best as possible from the 59-week process, but to actually allow people to when I say that, local authorities, to build between 30 and 40 units and to just go through a one-stage process. So it has been broadly welcomed by a number of the chief executives that I've spoken to on it. Are we ready to go with this from the 1st of January? Just trying to see, is there anything else that you didn't return? Yeah, sorry, credit union funds. I didn't get to that in my first round of questioning. Raised this with yourself and Minister English a number of times in priority questions in the Dáil. Credit unions have 750 million in their first tranche in relation to invest in social and or affordable housing. It's been approved by the Central Bank as a method for, as a vehicle for investment since the 1st of February this year. The SPV is still not set up. Minister English, in his answer to me a number of weeks ago in the Dáil, wasn't actually correct. I've since gone back to the credit union sector, and the SPV model is not set up. They're not investing in social or affordable housing. I think it's a real opportunity. It's a massive opportunity, actually, to utilise new funds in that sector to deliver homes. And there's nothing better, if you think, from credit union investment, that they're investing in homes in their own communities. So what's happening there? Is it finance don't want it to happen? And when will the SPV be set up that we can allow credit unions invest in social and affordable housing? Thanks.
Thanks, Dara. Richard.
Okay.
Minister, first of all, I'm not interested in making political charges for the sake of it or any other charges. I'm interested in getting to the facts, okay? I'm well aware there's lots of different streams, and that's not what I asked, okay? I am interested to know, and I think you have an obligation to tell us, what is the real addition to the local authority housing stock, okay? I know that's only one stream. What is the real addition for 2017? And what the NOAC report shows is that the additional local authority housing stock was 2,019 for 2017. That's what it shows. The figure at the beginning of the year, the figure at the end of the year. It shows that in Dublin, the additional stock is 564. Okay? That is very, very substantially less than the additional stock that is suggested by the figures that you gave for 2017 in specifically local authority. Okay? And I would like an answer as to that. And I believe it is because when you demolish stuff and then you rebuild stuff, if what you rebuild is less than what you demolish, there's actually a net reduction. And crucially, the big issue is the issue of voids and how they're defined, long-term versus short-term and so on, but that actually what are in effect casual vacancies are being counted as additional stock. Okay, that's my explanation, but there's definitely a discrepancy. If you can't answer it now, I would like an answer because I think it's important. By the way, just on figures as well, you gave some additional figures for HAP. 13,741, I think, at end of Q3. Could you tell us, and I think they should be included in all the figures, how many landlords pulled out of HAP in the same period? Okay? Because we need to know how secure or not secure HAP tenancies are, because certainly anecdotally you meet lots of people who find themselves back in emergency accommodation or back in trouble even though they got a HAP tenancy previously. On the issue of affordability, you didn't really answer my question. Biggest residential development in the state, that's not unimportant, right? And we're being told 400,000 just cost to build, right, by the developer. So I do not see how that really helps us resolve the problem. You can say supply, 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 but supply at that price doesn't help, right? And the prices aren't coming down. And anecdotally again, when I met the young people who were up in the Oireachtas place in Sandyford, where Oireachtas tried to put up the rent by about 40%. The rents were already 2,200 in those units, and Oireachtas tried to put them up to 2,800. Now, they stopped because of the embarrassment of the issue being raised. But when I talked to the people in there, what did you have in there? You had 5 and 6 students in a place, or you had 5 or 6 IT workers working in Sandyford, all right, piled in together, paying rents they could barely afford. And then I think to myself, what's going to happen in 5 years' time to those people when they have kids and families, right? They can afford it if 5 or 6 people pile in together just about at those sort of rents. And we'll have similar rents in Cherrywood if it's buy to rent. But in 5 or 6 years' time, that'll be useless to them. Right, so this is my problem, is about affordability. And even on the affordable base we're going to get, it's not clear in Cherrywood for the LIHAF funding, for all the stuff that we paid to put in terms of the infrastructure, how much actual affordable housing are we going to get back, and what will that affordable be given the extremely high price that they are talking about. Last question, building heights, okay? The impact of raising building heights, Owen has already mentioned in terms of land values and so on. Can I also ask, have you considered the possibility that by raising these heights, people who already have planning permissions are now going to pull those planning permissions and do new ones, right? Slowing down delivery because they think, ooh, I can get an extra few stories now, right? I think that is very likely to happen. Have you considered the impact of that? Because we know there's a lot of hoarding and speculating going on, right? So it's very likely this will be a trigger for that kind of activity.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputies, for that round of questions. I'll try and answer them all as I took notes of them. I'll work from Owen's questions first. Actually, I'll work in the order that they were asked. So if we look at Q3 and we look at the delivery in terms of the bill side, we look that we have to do a lot of heavy lifting in the fourth quarter. But that's not to give the impression that these houses haven't started being built yet, and we have to go on site in Q4 and get them built. it's funny because we're sitting here in a position in the middle of December talking about Q3, so we do have sight on what's coming through, and that's why we have the different, when we talk about a pipeline, the different stages of the pipeline and what's happening on site. So when we look to last year, we had a similar conversation last year. We actually delivered 60% of the build in the final quarter, and that those homes were completed in the final quarter. It's just the way the delivery is programmed. And even though those concerns were raised at this point last year, similar concerns, we ended up only being 8% off our build target, which in anything in government, when you have a target and you're only 8% off, I think is admirable. It's not 100%, but we weren't far off it. So we have a similar stream coming online in this fourth quarter in terms of completions. And, you know, unless there's some sort of severe weather event, which we don't see from the forecast standing in our way, that would take people off sites between now and the end of the year, I think we're going to be very successful in terms of what we're reporting in January as to the increase in social housing stock, but also what has been completed in terms of new builds as part of that increase in the stock of social housing. In terms of voids, I'm not going to take it out of the report, but we're not counting above the ceilings anymore, which I think is important. So that people know what was programmed in terms of our voids programme as part of the delivery. You know, we're not going to keep homes vacant that could be brought back into use under this funding line, but we're not going to count above the ceilings. My apologies, the rent bill isn't yet published. I thought it had been published yesterday evening, but it just takes a couple of days for the office just to do the relevant legal stamps and stuff, but that will be published imminently. So where the RTB decides to go with an administrative sanction, if the landlord accepts that, then it gets signed off by the circuit court. So you can imagine that the RTB might deal with 30 cases in a meeting, where it is agreed with what has been, what the deciding officer has determined, and then the landlords agree, and then the circuit court will, you know, in a private sitting, get these 30 things and say, yeah, that's fine. Where that doesn't happen, of course, the landlord has rights to go to the circuit court. We can't take those rights away; they're enshrined in the Constitution. But I think by giving this administrative sanction, I think we have potentially really short-circuited the potential delays that might be there in terms of the RTB being able to do its work independently. The board has to be the ones, it has to go to the board, was the legal advice from the AGs, because they are, if you like, they are the RTB. They are the enshrined office in terms of the decision-making body.
Is that the case with fines issued by the RTB currently?
I would imagine it is, because I don't think anyone else can issue a fine but the board. I mean, that was the legal advice that we got back on this new level of administrative sanction. So, yeah, my understanding actually, and I could see it now in my head from reading some of the files, is that they do. In relation to CAF and affordability, so we've determined in terms of our conversations ahead of the budget that the best way to deliver affordable homes at scale and to know that we're delivering them is to use our own land, local authority land, and that's the Service Sites Fund. And we also believe that by doing it in this way and by using other mechanisms, we can leverage European Investment Bank funding, which allows us to actually lock in cost rental when we talk about affordability. And so these are the mechanisms that we have approached to deliver cost rental and to deliver affordable purchase as well on local authority land.
Just that doesn't answer the question just about the affordability of the start-off rent. That was my question.
Yeah, but you're asking if we could use CAF as a way of getting affordable homes and not just CAF for social housing.
No, if you have an EIB loan for 25 years for cost rental and you have to pay that down plus the management and maintenance of the properties, your start-off rent will be at a certain point, right? Because you have to pay all the cost over your 25 years. If you have 70% EIB loan and 30% CAF loan, and you pay the CAF loan down over an additional 10 years, that gives you 35 years to repay, which allows you to have a lower start-off rent. The fear we all have, like within a scary road, the start-off rents in the cost rental won't be affordable. And that's why I'm saying, could you not combine the two, as you do with social housing, to make the cost rental rents affordable for average income families?
I understand the point you're making. No, we're going to do that with the Service Sites Fund instead. That's the decision that we've taken, rental. Is to, yes, use EIB with Service Sites Fund for both affordable purchase and cost rental. And of course, the application being successful to the EIB, but we know that from the engagement we've had today that they are, supportive of what we're trying to do, and they're familiar with the models that we're trying to use because they've helped us design them. In relation to the Service Sites Fund itself, I've always been very clear that we've been talking about an equity share. That this would be very similar to the scheme that's operated in the UK, where the local authority would help take the burden of the the loan to be retained by the local authority and be repaid over time or on sale of the house, and that it was an equity stake. In relation to drawdown and the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, I mean, drawdown isn't necessarily a measure of the success of a financial product, because a lot of things can happen whereby a person gets approval and doesn't draw down. The sale falls through. They get gazumped. Their work circumstances change, and therefore where they want to live changes. So while it's important to understand that drawdowns are happening and that therefore people are being able to access this loan, I think it's not an actual very good measure of how successful it is being. That being said, we're potentially going to hit 50% drawdown in the first quarter of next year. On the 1-year anniversary of actually opening up this product, we could hit 50% drawdown, a product that was meant to be in place for 3 years. So drawdowns is telling us something significant.
50% of drawdown of the allocation, but not of the approved applications.
Sorry, Owen, I'm just anxious that
Sure.
the clock is running down, and so if the Minister could continue without interruption to answer.
Right. I understand the point you're making. In relation to Victor, Senator, your questions, I'm hoping to get the criteria for the Service Science Fund next week. But there's a number of things that I need to get through by the end of the year, commitments that I made, in relation to things like the Land Development Agency, in relation to its board, things around MICA, etc. So the point I was making in the opening comments was that not having the more detailed criteria with each local authority is not delaying the bringing forward of sites. Where these criteria get important for the person on the street is when the actual homes begin construction. And the most important thing, so first of all, is to get those sites agreed and then get the construction underway. So that comes to another point you asked that I'll jump to. Local authorities' assessments and affordability. So we've already gone out and done a first call to 11 local authorities. 11 local authorities that we know, without doing too much modelling, that there's an affordability problem. 9 came back, and we have now, and you have it in your documentation, Dublin and Cork being agreed in principle, and the further sites that we need to progress. But it is true to say that there are some local authorities that will need to do a proper economic appraisal to actually look at, well, how many vacant homes are there? What is the cost of a home on the second-hand market, to call it the second-hand market, versus the cost of a new build? Notwithstanding the fact that we need to increase delivery anyway, and so they can actually make the numbers stack up, because again, this is public money, and we can't just sign blank cheques. So they've been asked to do that assessment. That assessment will be done. That assessment will inform our second call. But the key. When's the deadline for that? End of November for the current assessment. But if a Dublin local authority, is telling you that they.
There are 4 of them.
Yeah, but but we put this call out to the Dublin local authorities during the summer, Senator. Right? Out to 11 local authorities, which included the 4 Dublins. 9 came back, and now we have the first sites for approval in that table. So it is not the case to say that a local authority is sitting there saying, oh, the department's asking us to do some sort of assessment and we haven't done it yet, and what's this about? Of course, it's an affordability issue. We did that with the Dublins in the summer.
Have the 4, can you just ask, have the 4 sent them back?
You have the tables in front. I don't have that table in front of me.
Okay.
I'm just being told 3 did and 1 didn't. Okay. In relation to the circulars, we have agreed with the committee about the circulars. I think, Chair, you clarified that. In relation to vacancy, that has been achieved in terms of putting the teams in place as per that item. There was a Q3 report on the vacancy work underway. I think that was published. So the committee should have that report as well. Deputy Dara, to call you by your first name, DD. Just because I would better. Do we have to look at HAP? Yes, we do.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to look at it until we get to sustainable supply, until I know that we don't need it to the degree that we need it now. Obviously, we all know that if we were to just withdraw HAP tomorrow, that wouldn't solve the problems that people have. But as we get to that 1 in 5 homes at a consistent level that are being built each year, being social housing stock homes, then we can start to see, well, what is, I mean, there'll always be a need for HAP. People will always like the flexibility of HAP for a number of reasons. But we shouldn't be using it to the degree that we are now, but we have to for legacy reasons that I think are all clear. But we are getting to a point at the end of Rebuilding Ireland, as we move into 2020 on to 2021, where we're putting more people into the stock of social housing than through HAP. At that point in time, we will then need to look and see, well, look, to what degree is HAP sustainable into the future at the level that it is, and what does that mean? But now is not the point in time to do that. So I don't think we're on a different page. No, it's just a timing issue.
I'm talking about pulling it, I'm just saying over lines, that's it.
Rebuilding Ireland review, the home loan, consistency is key. So in the different recommendations that came to me, one of the ones that came across a number of different areas of this was consistency in application in each local authority. So at the beginning of next year, we'll be able to begin. There's a kind of there's two tiers of recommendations, if you like, in terms of how I've tiered them in my own head. One is the easy stuff that we can just begin to do at the beginning of the year to local authorities in terms of notifications and a few more training rounds. The other need to be discussed with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and that's a bit of a more complicated process. But both are in train, and I raised both aspects of it with the Minister for Finance and with the Taoiseach last week in a meeting. The one-stage approval process, we have committed to looking at the one-stage approval process. We are doing that with per...
6 million.
So the one stage is now a 2 million ceiling, and we've talked about raising it to 6 million.
We've agreed to raise
and we're doing that, and we're looking as long as it's in compliance with the public spending code. That's happening with per.
Sorry, it was agreed.
There's two different versions here. Agreed to we're looking at. Who's telling the truth?
The camera didn't
agreed.
Catch my
Agreed.
wink.
It was agreed.
Subject to the public spending code. But let's just be clear. Let's not fool ourselves. Local authority managers are telling you that there's a 4-stage approval process and it's taking them too long, when they could have taken those projects through the one-stage approval but didn't.
I'm telling you, we had these discussions prior to the budget, and the raising of the cap from 2 to 6 million was a request that we made, which is a very important one.
Yeah.
So it wasn't conditional. Okay.
Everything is conditional on the public spending code.
Okay. Well,
the public spending code is something that we're all tied by. Deputy, you as well.
Yeah, of course. But the question that I asked though is, have we advised the local authorities of this change? And are they aware of it? Because then you can beat them up again in the middle of next year if they don't use it.
I'm
also giving you a stick here.
Yeah, but there's an existing stick, which is a huge amount of schemes. I think something like 200 schemes could have gone through one stage and didn't. We went for 4-stage instead. Why is that?
But until we started raising this. But anyway.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, so what I can tell you is that in an engagement that I had with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, I think it was probably 3 weeks ago at this stage, maybe 4 weeks. There's always ongoing engagements between myself and Minister of Finance and the Taoiseach. This issue was raised, and an agreement was given by Department of Public Expenditure Reform at the time. So we are almost there, and we'll have something in January.
Could I get a written update?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Please?
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
problem.
Okay.
It's possible they could turn it down, so is what you're saying. It might not meet the public spending code. That is a possibility. It's not your desired outcome.
I think, Deputy, if it came to that, I would look to amend the public spending code. I wouldn't want to inadvertently cause a general election here across the committee floor. It's such a sensitive time. It's such a sensitive time. Don't believe when you read the papers, Deputy. Don't believe you read the papers.
Carry on. Just give me a note on it.
I'll be facing you, don't worry, for a long time across this committee.
We shall see.
Yeah, well, your predecessor thought the same when he left. Anyway, credit union funding.
Is that right?
I beg your pardon.
Be careful now. Be careful. You know why you're there.
Please.
Do you want to get into this?
No, Minister, and Dara, please.
Credit union funding. So we have changed the law. The central bank has changed the conditions around credit union funding. They have done that piece, right? We have provided funding to allow the credit unions explore how they put together a special purpose vehicle. We cannot force a housing body and a credit union to get together in an SPV. And we can't do it for them either. We can't set up the SPV.
That's not
sorry, Dara.
That is where it's not.
It's not.
It is.
I'll talk to you about it. It's not.
You had this engagement
Damien
with
English came into
Minister
the
English.
doll and actually gave a completely incorrect version
fairness,
of where that's at.
cut into other members, so let the Minister finish.
Just to clarify.
And Minister, you stop adding fuel.
I beg your pardon. Chair, I'm sorry. He pushes certain buttons.
We know that, yes.
It is the truth.
We can spend hours in here.
We could, but we'll talk about it offside.
Gentlemen, please now.
But another priority question and get a correct answer to where it's at.
No. Let's be fair to Minister English. The correct answer was given in the exchange during PQs. The changes we made by the central bank, we provided funding for the special purpose vehicle. We cannot force a housing body, which is not a government body, and a credit union, which is not a government body, to come together to make an arrangement for one to invest in the other to deliver housing. We can't force them to do that. That is not where
Gentlemen, please, can we...
And Deputy Boyd Barrett. So, NOAC doesn't count housing bodies in Part 5, and those are social housing homes that come into the social housing stock. People come off the local authority housing lists and into those homes, right? No, but my point is that people seem to deliberately go out to give the impression that the numbers aren't correct.
Okay, I accept those other streams, but would you answer the question though?
Well, yes, 4,054 was the increase in the stock of social housing from build through local authorities, housing bodies and Part 5, and all of the people going into those homes are coming off the local authority housing lists. In relation to HAP, we have the table that you would have gotten in the update that was given to you. We give you now a regular update on HAP. I don't know if you saw this table in the documentation.
I'm not on the committee, so I didn't.
Oh, well,
you could send it to me, though. I very much appreciate it.
If you put down a PQ, I'll give it to you.
That's it.
No, but just to let you know, so if we look at this particular analysis, which is of the tenancies exiting HAP, 9,050 have exited HAP since it's been established. 3,548 were tenant-led exits, and the reasons for that would be a voluntary exit, deceased tenant, working in a different area, a change in family composition, educational reasons, but also antisocial behaviour in relation to a third party not living in the home. In relation to landlord exits, 2,624 landlord exits. That has been related to notice being given to a tenant, the selling of a property, receivership, monthly rent increases happening. Transfers to other forms of social housing, 1,765 exits from HAP, so people moving into social housing, and then 1,113 exits have been in relation to compliance, non-payment of rent, antisocial behaviour, those types of things. So, and also tax clearance certificates in relation to property standards. So, what we are doing with HAP, Deputy, every quarter is giving more and more detailed information because we have this excellent system that's been run out of Limerick, I beg your pardon, that we're trying to improve all the time. And it's allowing us to produce these very detailed reports that you don't have because you're not a member of the committee, and my apologies because I knew you'd be in attendance, so it would have made sense to give it to you in advance so we could have a more detailed discussion. No doubt we will next time. In relation to Cherrywood...
We'll send that on.
I think you committed to put down a PQ and I'll give it to you, is that?
We'll email it on to him, Minister. No need for a PQ.
Okay,
we'll
email. Okay. Thank you, Senator. Cherrywood. First of all, your general point around prices. Prices are coming down in terms of the price. I mean, what we're looking at is single-digit price inflation for house buying this year, which is very important because it shows a growth in inflation, and all the different indicators are telling us that. Cherrywood, yes, the cost of building is going to be expensive, but they are looking at the build-to-rent model, which we need more of as we professionalise our landlord sector. But I don't see how you can't see 9,000 new homes for 23,000 new people, a new town with sporting facilities and transport and places to work not helping. Of course it helps. It's not going to help. It's not going to help everyone. It's not going to help everyone, but it's going to help. And if people are going to be buying at higher prices, then it frees up homes at lower prices for people who can't afford at the higher prices. It all helps. Every bit of delivery helps in terms of supply. Deputy, it does, because people are going to go and live in those homes. And it's going to help those people who get those keys and live there. In relation to heights, you know, not to try and start a fight at the end of the meeting, but I hope that people are not going to start questioning our heights policy based on local concerns. We have had local interests. Now, I'll come to the point you were making in a second, but this is an important point to make, because for years local interests have tried to trump good planning, good design, good housing policy, and they have been successful. And earlier on at the committee I said that we need to really be resolved as an Oireachtas, that we as politicians will not get in the way of the densification of urban places that are lovely places to live at the moment, that have lovely facilities and amenities, but could take more homes if we densify. And a part of that is increasing heights as well. It's possible. Of course, if you look at a piece of land, you need to look at the optimal use for the piece of land. And if you allow for there to be more apartments built on that land, then you'll be able to sell more apartments. Therefore, you'll be able to make more money. Therefore, yes, it's possible that the price of land might increase. But it's also more expensive to build higher as well. So you incur more costs as well. And you have to wonder about the economics of that too. But if you were to look at it purely on that point of view, purely on that very basic point of view, the point of land, you'd be building one home per piece of land, because that would keep the price rock bottom. You have to look at an economic model as the different factors that go into a piece of land and what is the optimal use. And that's what people do when they come to a piece of land. And you asked another question around possible delays. I think we are dealing with a shortage, absolutely. That shortage needs to be fixed, but it needs to be fixed in a way that is sustainable. There is no point in us building to arbitrary height caps that would see us then facing much bigger challenges when it comes to prices and affordability in the future, 30 years down the line, commuting distances trying to get in, because we didn't build enough homes in places where we could at the time when we knew we could have, had we have changed the law. And if that meant someone over the last 6 months waiting for the public consultation to finish, delaying putting in a planning application, I understand that. But if that meant that we were going to get 30% more homes, 40% more homes, 50% more homes on a site, homes that will be there for the next 100 years. And that was something that we had to do now to protect ourselves into the future. And then in relation to land hoarding, currently there's 300 million worth of land that is liable for the vacant site levy that kicks in on the 1st of January next year. That will only increase because that 300 million accounts to 140 properties. But there's 300 now on the register. Yes, we need to do more work here, but 300 million worth of land is not a small amount. And that will only rise to next year because the levy is more than doubling, but also we've put far many more houses. We've doubled the amount of houses that are on the register in terms of that amount of money that's going to apply.
Okay. And I would like to thank the Minister and the officials for attending today's meeting and engaging with the committee. This meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Thursday, the 17th of January 2019 at 9:30 a.m. Thank you all very much, and a very happy Christmas to all.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Colin.